The porch boards creaked beneath the weight of two souls separated by 58 years and bound by blood that ran deeper than time itself. New Mexico stretched before them in the afternoon heat of May, 1920, the desert painted in shades of burnt orange and dusty gold, a landscape that remembered everything and forgave nothing. Wyatt sat with his legs dangling over the edge too short to reach the weathered planks below. 10 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that caught the sun in a way that spoke of two worlds meeting in a single boy. His right cheek carried a bruise the color of storm clouds fresh enough that touching it still brought tears to eyes he refused to let spill. His grandfather sat in the rocking chair that had become an extension of his body, 68 years of living etched into every line of his face like a map of hard-won territory. Ethan Caldwell wore his age the way the desert wore its scars, with a quiet dignity that came from surviving what should have killed him. His hands, gnarled and spotted with the evidence of decades under an unforgiving sun, rested on the armrests with a stillness that suggested he had learned long ago that some battles were won by refusing to move. On his left wrist, 3 stones caught the light, white, red, black, smooth from 28 years of constant wear strung on leather that had been replaced a dozen times, but never the stones themselves, never those 3 witnesses to a day when death had circled close enough to taste. The silence between them held the weight of unsaid things of a boy trying to find words for a shame that sat heavy in his chest, and a man trying to remember how to reach across the distance that grief and time had carved between generations. Wyatt's mother had brought him an hour ago, her face tight with worry, her hands gripping her son's shoulders too hard as she'd spoken to Ethan in a voice that tried to be steady and failed. "He needs to talk to you, Father Ethan, about what happened at school, about what the boys said to him." She'd left them alone, then retreating into the small house that Ethan had bought with money saved from 2 decades of building bridges between worlds that wanted nothing more than to destroy each other. "Who did this to you, boy?" Ethan's voice carried the roughness of years spent breathing dust and speaking truths that no one wanted to hear. Wyatt's hand moved to his cheek, fingers brushing the tender skin before falling away. "Boys at school." The words came out small, ashamed. "They say I'm dirty because Grandma was Indian. They say I'm not really American. They say I should go back to the reservation." The rocking chair stopped its gentle motion. Ethan leaned forward, and in that movement Wyatt saw something that looked like the sun coming out from behind clouds, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with understanding. "What did you say to them?" "Nothing." Wyatt's voice broke on the word. "I was ashamed." "Are they right, Grandpa? Is it bad to be part Apache?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had been burning for generations, a question that had no simple answer because the asking of it revealed wounds that went deeper than any bruise on any cheek. Ethan reached out and took his grandson's hand, and in that touch, Wyatt felt something solid, something that spoke of anchors in storms and lighthouses in fog. "Let me tell you a story, Wyatt, about the day I almost died because I was too proud to see the truth. About the day I learned that being ashamed of who you are is the fastest way to become nothing at all." Ethan's other hand moved to his wrist fingers, touching the 3 stones with the reverence of a man handling sacred things. "You see these stones? White, red, black?" Wyatt nodded, his eyes fixed on his grandfather's face, searching for something he didn't yet know how to name. "An Apache chief tied them on my wrist 28 years ago after 420 warriors surrounded my cabin with drawn bows, with arrows pointed at my heart, with war paint fresh on their faces and death in their eyes." Wyatt's bruise forgotten, he leaned forward, drawn into the gravity of words that promised revelation. "Why did they want to kill you?" "Because I made a choice without knowing the cost, and that choice changed everything." Ethan's eyes grew distant, seeing across decades to a June morning in Arizona Territory when the world had narrowed to the space between breathing and dying. It started on an afternoon in 1892 when I was 40 years old and foolish enough to think kindness had no price. The desert around them seemed to shift, the light bending backward through time, carrying both of them to a place where heat became a living thing, and survival was measured in heartbeats. Arizona Territory, June 14, 1892. The sun hung overhead like a judgment, turning the air thick enough to chew. 108 degrees by the thermometer, Ethan kept nailed to the side of his cabin, and the mercury was still climbing toward the daily peak that would arrive around 3 in the afternoon and stay there like an unwelcome guest until sunset brought its small mercy. Ethan Caldwell, at 40, carried the look of a man who had stopped fighting with his ghosts and learned instead to live alongside them, giving them space, but refusing to let them drive. His cabin, 16 feet by 20, sat in a hollow between two rises of red rock, positioned to catch what little breeze the desert offered and to provide sightlines in all directions, because survival in Apache country meant seeing what was coming before it arrived close enough to matter. The walls were adobe 18 inches thick, built by his own hands in the summer of 1880, when he and Catherine had arrived full of hope and the kind of ignorance that comes from believing that wanting something badly enough makes it true. One window with iron bars he'd forged himself, heating the metal over a fire that had taken 3 days to get hot enough, hammering the shape he needed on a flat rock because he couldn't afford an anvil. A door made of oak planks he'd traded 2 months of labor to acquire, reinforced with iron straps that had cost him another month, because in this country a door that couldn't stop a determined intruder was the same as no door at all. Inside the cabin held the sparse evidence of a life pared down to essentials: a cot against one wall, a table and single chair, a cast-iron stove that threw heat in winter and sat cold the rest of the year because cooking over an open fire outside made more sense when the alternative was turning your home into an oven. Shelves held canned goods bought in Wilcox on his monthly supply runs, ammunition for the Winchester rifle that leaned against the wall within arm's reach of everywhere he might need it, and a small wooden box he never opened anymore, the one that held a photograph of Catherine on their wedding day, her face bright with futures that would never arrive. 9 years since she'd died. 9 years since he'd held her hand through 18 hours of labor that had started with hope and ended with 2 graves he'd dug by lamplight and ground so hard he'd broken 3 shovel handles before reaching depth enough to bury what love had cost him. The baby had never drawn breath, had never opened eyes that might have been blue like Catherine's or brown like his own, had never done anything except kill his mother by the simple act of existing in a position that no amount of midwife skill could correct. Breach, they'd called it, turned wrong, and by the time they'd known, it was too late for anything except watching Catherine slip away, despite every prayer Ethan had never believed in, but offered anyway, bargaining with a God he'd stopped trusting after the war, in exchange for a miracle that never came. He'd buried them together, Catherine and the son he'd named Daniel, even though the boy had never lived to carry it wrapped in the good quilt she'd brought from Tennessee, the one she'd planned to use for the baby's crib. He'd stood over that grave until the sun came up, until the heat drove him back to the cabin, until the simple mechanics of breathing became something he had to remember to do. That had been 1883. April 12th. A date burned into memory the way lightning burns patterns into wood. For 9 years after Ethan had lived the way a man lives when he's already died, but his body hasn't figured it out yet. Work during the day enough to keep the farm running, enough to keep food on the table, enough to prevent thought. Sleep at night when exhaustion finally overcame the memory of Catherine's last words. Pride kills Ethan. Humility saves. She'd been talking about letting the midwife try the forceps, about accepting help, even when accepting meant admitting you couldn't fix it yourself. The words had been meant for that moment, but they'd outlived her, sitting in his head like unwelcome guests at a table set for one. No friends, not anymore. After the raid in 1881, after he'd led the settlers to that Apache camp in the mountains, after 3 Apache warriors had died, and one settler named Thomas Mitchell had taken a bullet to the chest and bled out before they could get him home, the community had split on whether Ethan was a hero or a coward. He'd refused to ride with them again, refused to track, refused to participate in the cycle of violence that fed itself on blood and grief, and the refusing had marked him as something suspect, something not quite trustworthy, something that might turn against its own kind if push came to shove. So they'd left him alone, and he'd learned to prefer it that way, learned to find comfort in the silence that asked nothing and judged less. Every Sunday he rode to the grave, 5 miles northeast on a rise where the view stretched far enough to see tomorrow coming. He'd sit there for an hour sometimes talking to Catherine about the small things, the weather, the garden that never quite produced what the seed packets promised, the way the desert looked at sunset when the whole world turned the color of fire. Sometimes he'd sit silent, just being there, as if proximity to her bones could bridge the distance death had carved between them. Last Sunday he'd sat there longer than usual, the words coming harder, weighted with something that felt too much like giving up. "I'm tired, Catherine. Tired of living like this. Tired of waking up to nothing and going to bed with less. Tired of carrying this weight that never gets lighter no matter how many years pass." The wind had been his only answer, and maybe that was answer enough. But today was Thursday, June 14th, and Ethan had business in Wilcox that couldn't wait. Supplies running low, coffee nearly gone, flour down to the last few pounds, salt pork turning questionable in the heat. He'd saddled Copper his Appaloosa gelding at dawn, made the 15-mile ride in 4 hours, bought what he needed from merchants who took his money but didn't quite meet his eyes, and headed home. 4 o'clock in the afternoon when he saw her. The travois lay on its side 200 yards off the main trail, the broken crossbeam obvious even from a distance, and beside it a woman knelt in the dust with the kind of focus that suggested she believed willpower alone could mend wood. Ethan's first instinct was the one 9 years of solitude had taught him. Keep riding. Not your business. Not your problem. In Arizona Territory in 1892, stopping for strangers was the kind of kindness that could get you killed, that could leave you bleeding in the dust while your horse wandered home without you, that could make you the cautionary tale other settlers told their children about the price of being soft. But something made him slow Copper to a walk, something about the woman's stillness, the way she worked without looking up, without acknowledging his approach, as if she existed in a space where men on horses were beneath notice or beyond relevance. Apache he knew immediately. The buckskin dress decorated with chunks of turquoise that caught the afternoon light like captured sky, the way her black hair hung in a braid down her back. The careful beadwork on her moccasins that spoke of hours of patient labor. Dangerous, his mind supplied. Apache meant trouble, meant raids, meant the kind of violence that left homesteads burning and families dead. But the broken travois spoke of vulnerability, of someone stranded, of a problem that needed solving, and somewhere in the part of Ethan that hadn't quite died with Catherine, something stirred that felt uncomfortably like responsibility. He thought of Catherine of 18 hours holding her hand while she died by inches of helplessness that had carved itself into his bones, of the way no one had been able to help when help mattered most. He thought of the Williams family, of Jack Williams, who'd been the closest thing to a friend Ethan had allowed himself in those early years of Jack's wife Mary and their 2 children Emma and Thomas Jr. of the day. He'd heard the shots and seen the smoke and kept riding, because it wasn't his fight, wasn't his problem, wasn't worth the risk. Of finding their bodies 2 days later, of knowing that if he'd stopped, if he'd helped, maybe 4 people would still be breathing. The guilt of that had weight, the kind that settled in the chest and made breathing feel like theft. Maybe this was his chance to be different. Maybe this was his chance to be the man who stopped instead of the man who rode past. Maybe this was how you paid for cowardice, one small act of courage at a time. Ethan dismounted. The woman looked up as his boots hit the ground, and Ethan saw her eyes for the first time. Dark, unreadable set, in a face that gave away nothing, framed by loose strands of black hair that had escaped her braid and moved slightly in the hot wind. 28, maybe 30 years old, though age was hard to read in faces that the desert had weathered before their time. She didn't speak. Didn't thank him for stopping, didn't ask for help, didn't acknowledge his presence, except to shift slightly, creating space for him to approach the broken travois without getting too close to her. Ethan walked over, keeping his movements slow and obvious, keeping his hands visible, giving her every chance to read his intentions as harmless. The crossbeam had split clean through, probably from hitting a rock or dropping into a gopher hole at the wrong angle, the kind of break that rendered the whole apparatus useless, unable to carry whatever supplies she'd been hauling behind her horse. He gestured to the damage, a silent offer of help. She considered him for a long moment, her gaze steady in a way that made him feel measured, assessed, evaluated for flaws or weaknesses or reliability. Then she stepped back a single economical movement that said more than words could have, giving him permission to try. Ethan pulled an ironwood piece from his saddlebag, a spare he kept for emergencies. Ironwood was dense and strong, the desert's answer to oak, and it would hold better than the original pine. He used rawhide strips to bind it, the same technique his father had taught him back in Tennessee before the war, before everything changed, before the world learned that some wounds never closed, no matter how much time passed. Wet the rawhide, wrap it tight, let it dry in the sun. As it dried, it would shrink, creating a grip as strong as iron, a bond that would hold under stress and strain and the weight of whatever burdens needed carrying. The whole repair took 18 minutes. He timed it by the sun's movement across the sky, an old habit from his farming days, when every hour of daylight mattered, when seasons turned on, whether you planted early or late, when survival came down to paying attention to things most people never noticed. She watched every movement, not with gratitude, which would have been easy to read, but with that same intense focus, as if she were memorizing every cut, every knot, every decision he made. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't name, made him feel like he was being studied for reasons that had nothing to do with the task at hand. When he finished, she tested the travois, rolling it back and forth, checking the repair with the thoroughness of someone whose life might depend on equipment not failing. She gave a single nod, no smile, no thank you. Just that one gesture of acknowledgement that the work was acceptable. Then she climbed onto her horse, took the reins and rode off without looking back. Without a word, without anything to mark the encounter except the space where she'd been and the question of why Ethan's hands were shaking slightly as he mounted Copper and turned toward home. The entire exchange had lasted maybe 20 minutes, and as Ethan rode away, he thought nothing more of it. Just another moment in a long string of moments that made up his quiet, solitary life. He returned to his cabin unsaddled. Copper fed him, brushed him down, turned him loose in the small corral. Ate a cold supper of beans and salt pork because firing up the stove in this heat made no sense. Cleaned his Winchester, the ritual of it soothing in its familiarity, the smell of gun oil and the mechanical precision of checking the action, ensuring everything moved the way it should. Lit his kerosene lamp as the sun set, tried to read a 3-year-old farmer's almanac until his eyes grew heavy with the weight of another day survived but not quite lived. But before sleep claimed him completely, he did what he always did. He walked the perimeter of his cabin, checking for tracks, for signs of visitors, for threats that might materialize in the dark, when a man's guard was down, and his chances were measured by how fast he could reach his rifle. That night, he found something that made his stomach clench tight as a fist. Fresh hoofprints, dozens of them unshod horses the way Apache rode, leaving distinctive tracks in the sand. They'd been positioned in the mesquite bushes about 200 yards from where he'd helped the woman, hidden well enough that he wouldn't have seen them in daylight unless he'd been looking, unless he'd known what to look for. At least 12 to 15 horses, based on the depth and spread of the prints, based on how the ground was disturbed, based on the evidence of animals standing still for an extended period, waiting, watching. They'd been watching. Watching him. Watching her. Watching the entire encounter. The woman hadn't been alone. She'd never been alone. Ethan stood there in the darkness, his heart beginning to race, understanding dawning like cold water down his spine. The broken travois, the vulnerable position, the timing. It had all been staged. They'd watched him stop, watched him help, watched him leave, and he had no idea what it meant except that nothing good came from being watched by Apache warriors who stayed hidden. He loaded his Winchester, then checked that his Bowie knife was sharp, placed the rifle within arm's reach of his bed. If they came for him that night, he'd at least make them work for it, at least die like a man who refused to go quietly into whatever darkness they'd planned for him. But the night passed in oppressive silence, the kind of quiet that feels more threatening than noise, the kind that makes every small sound magnify into potential danger. And when dawn came with the sound of 400 hooves, Ethan understood that they'd been waiting for something more than just darkness. The sound came first, before consciousness, before fear had time to catch up with understanding. Hooves, hundreds of them, moving in a synchronized circle that made the desert floor tremble like a war drum beating against Ethan's chest, like thunder rolling across ground that rarely saw rain, like the end of the world, announcing itself with rhythmic precision. His eyes snapped open in the darkness of his cabin, and his hand found the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall before his mind fully registered what was happening. Before thought could catch up with instinct, before anything existed except the knowledge that survival often came down to the difference between waking fast and waking dead. 12 years of living alone in Apache country had taught him that lesson, had carved it into his bones the way water carves canyons, patient and permanent and deeper than conscious thought. Through the gap in the wooden shutters, Ethan could see the first gray hints of dawn bleeding into the Arizona sky. June 15, 1892, and the temperature outside was already climbing toward what would be another brutal 112 degrees by noon, the kind of heat that made breathing feel like labor, that turned the air into visible shimmers above the desert floor. But the heat wasn't what made his blood run cold. Surrounding his small adobe cabin in 3 perfect concentric circles were Apache warriors, and the geometry of their formation spoke of intention, of planning, of something far more serious than a raid. Ethan started counting them the way he'd count heads of cattle, methodically forcing his racing heart to slow, forcing his breathing to steady, forcing himself to think instead of panic, because panic was how you died stupid and fast. 20 in the first ring, their horses standing so still they might have been carved from stone. 20 more in the second ring, positioned with military precision. He stopped counting when he reached 420, stopped, because the number itself became meaningless, because whether you faced 400 or 500 warriors with drawn bows, the mathematics of survival were brutally simple. 420 painted faces, 420 drawn bows, 420 reasons why a 40-year-old widower who'd spent the last 9 years trying to forget the world might not see tomorrow. Ethan was no stranger to danger. He'd homesteaded this land since 1880, back when he was 28, and still believed that Arizona territory offered men like him a second chance, a place where the past could be left behind, like old clothes, where futures could be built from nothing more than sweat and stubbornness and the willingness to endure what would break lesser men. He'd defended his farm against raids, fought alongside his neighbors, when Apache war parties came down from the mountains looking for horses and supplies, looking to take back by force what had been taken from them by law and treaty and the slow grinding machinery of westward expansion. He'd even killed men, though the memory sat in his gut like swallowed stones, heavy and indigestible, the kind of weight that never lightened, no matter how many years you carried it. But he had never in 12 years of frontier living seen anything like this. This wasn't a raid. Raiders came fast and loud, hit their targets, and vanished into the canyons before the cavalry could respond, before anyone could mount an organized defense, before the cost of staying became higher than the value of what they'd come to take. This was something else entirely. This was ceremony. This was judgment. The warriors sat motionless on their Mustang ponies, their war paint fresh and stark in the growing light. Red ochre and black charcoal streaked across faces that showed no emotion, no hurry, no mercy, only the patient inevitability of men who knew they held all the power and could afford to wait. Some held bows with arrows already knocked, the sinew strings drawn halfway back, ready to release at a signal Ethan couldn't predict, at a word he wouldn't understand, at a moment that would arrive without warning and leave him no time to do anything except die. Others carried lances decorated with eagle feathers that moved slightly in the hot wind, each feather a mark of honor earned in combat, each lance a declaration of status within the tribe. And on some of those lances Ethan could see scalps, dark hair matted with dried blood trophies taken from enemies who'd learned too late that underestimating these men was the last mistake anyone ever made. His cabin was nothing impressive. 16 by 20 adobe walls, 18 inches thick to keep out the heat and theoretically to provide some protection against bullets, though Ethan had never tested that theory and had no desire to start now. One window with iron bars he'd forged himself in a fit of optimism about security. A door made of oak wood reinforced with iron straps, sturdy enough to stop a man, but not sturdy enough to stop 400 men with time and determination. Inside the space held everything he owned: a cot, a table, a cast-iron stove, and shelves holding canned goods and ammunition. No photographs, no reminders of the life he'd tried to build with Catherine, because he'd put those away 9 years ago, tucked them in a trunk he never opened, because looking at her face, at the life they'd planned together, was like pressing on a wound that refused to heal, like trying to hold water in hands made of sand, like believing that enough grief could bring back the dead. He grabbed his Winchester, a model 1873 that fired 44 caliber rounds. 28 bullets in the wooden box beside his bed. Against 420 warriors, the mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Even if every shot found its mark, even if he was the best marksman in Arizona territory, he'd be dead before he emptied the rifle twice, before he could reload, before he could do anything except make his dying expensive enough to be worth remembering. But Ethan's eyes kept returning to the center of the formation, to the woman seated on a painted horse between two massive warriors, and he recognized her immediately, even though he'd only seen her once before, just yesterday, when her travois had been broken and he'd been fool enough to stop. It was the woman whose wheel he'd fixed. Her name, he would learn, was Kaya. But in that moment, with dawn breaking and death circling his home like a wolf around wounded prey, he knew her only as the stranger he'd stopped to help on his ride back from Wilcox. The stranger who'd turned out to be bait in a trap he'd walked into with his eyes wide open and his brain turned off. Back on the porch in New Mexico, 1920. Wyatt's eyes were wide with the kind of attention that came from hearing something that mattered. Something that spoke to the questions burning in his chest about who he was and where he belonged, and whether the blood running through his veins made him less than the boys at school who'd hit him for the crime of being different. They were testing you. The question came out small, uncertain. Why? Ethan smiled, the expression carrying sadness and wisdom in equal measure. I didn't know then, boy. But the next morning I learned. I learned that stopping to help wasn't the act of kindness I'd thought it was. It was something far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more important than I could have imagined. What happened next morning, Grandpa? Ethan stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement in ways that reminded him of every year, every scar, every choice that had brought him to this porch, to this moment, to this chance to pass on what he'd learned to a grandson who needed it more than either of them had known. He poured water from the clay pitcher on the small table, the liquid catching the afternoon light as it fell, and he handed one cup to Wyatt before taking a long drink from his own. The water was cool, clean, and he let it sit on his tongue for a moment before swallowing, appreciating it in a way that only men who'd gone without could truly understand. What happened next changed my life forever, Wyatt. And it's why you should never, not for 1 second, be ashamed of who you are, of where you come from, of the blood that runs through your veins. He sat back down, and the rocking chair resumed its gentle motion, a rhythm that matched his breathing, that matched his heartbeat, that matched the cadence of truth being passed from one generation to the next. Imagine waking up to the sound of 400 horses circling your home, each one carrying a warrior with a bow and arrows and war paint, and the absolute certainty that your life was forfeit unless you could prove something you didn't even know you needed to prove. The transition back to 1892 was seamless. This time the story pulling both of them into its gravity, into the heat and dust and fear of that June morning when everything hung in balance and the scales were weighted against survival. The sun had climbed higher by the time Wyatt's mother called them in for lunch, her voice carrying across the porch with the kind of authority that knew no argument. The boy had barely touched his food, his mind too full of warriors and arrows, and a grandfather who'd stood against 400 men with nothing but truth and stubborn refusal to fall. His mother watched him push beans around his plate, her eyes moving between her son and her father-in-law, reading the change that had settled over the boy like morning dew on desert plants, subtle but transformative. "What did Grandpa tell you?" She asked it quietly, as if afraid the answer might be something she wasn't ready to hear. "About the day he almost died." Wyatt's voice carried a weight it hadn't held that morning, as if the story had added years to him, had given him access to knowledge that changed how the world looked. "And about being strong." His mother's hand found Ethan's shoulder as she cleared the plates, a gesture of gratitude that needed no words, an acknowledgement that sometimes the healing her son needed couldn't come from her, that sometimes a boy needed to hear from a man who'd walked through fire, what it meant to stand in the flames. After lunch, Wyatt was back on the porch before Ethan had finished his coffee, the boy's impatience evident in the way he bounced on the balls of his feet and the questions already forming on his lips before he'd fully sat down. "I'm ready for the rest, Grandpa." Ethan took another slow sip, letting the moment stretch, teaching without words that some things couldn't be rushed, that stories weren't races to be won, but journeys to be walked with proper attention to the terrain. "Slow down, boy. Stories aren't races. They're more like rivers. You have to let them flow at their own pace, or you miss what matters." He poured water from the clay pitcher, the sound of liquid meeting cup, a small music in the afternoon quiet, and handed one to Wyatt before keeping one for himself. "Drink slowly. Appreciate it. That's a lesson from Test 2. Wyatt took the cup, but his eyes never left his grandfather's face, searching for the continuation of a tale that had hooked itself into his imagination and refused to let go. What was Test 1? Test 1 was about endurance, about standing when every part of you wants to fall, about learning that pain is temporary, but quitting is permanent. Ethan's voice dropped lower, more intimate, as if sharing a secret that the desert might hear and remember. Just like those boys at school. They can hurt you today, Wyatt. They can make your face bruise and your pride sting. But if you quit on yourself, if you let their words make you ashamed of who you are, that pain lasts forever. That wound never heals. The boy nodded, understanding blooming in his eyes like flowers after rain, and Ethan felt something in his chest loosen slightly, felt the weight of years lighten by the smallest measure, knowing that maybe, just maybe, his story could do for his grandson what nothing else had managed. "Now let me tell you about standing in that sacred valley with 400 warriors watching with the sun turning the sky into hammered copper, with my body screaming for mercy that wouldn't come. The hidden valley opened before them like a wound cut into the earth, steep canyon walls rising on all sides to create a natural amphitheater that trapped sound and heat in equal measure. The Apache had funneled through the narrow entrance in groups of 20, a controlled procession that spoke of ceremony and ritual, of things done this way for generations of traditions that predated the arrival of white men and would outlast them regardless of how this day ended. At the center stood a flat expanse of hard-packed dirt, empty except for 3 wooden posts driven deep into the ground, each one twice the height of a man, weathered gray by sun and time, and the accumulated weight of purposes Ethan didn't want to contemplate too closely. Even from a distance, he could see the dark stains near the base of the center post, and his mind supplied the explanation he didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't avoid. Blood. Old blood soaked into wood that had absorbed the suffering of how many men before him, how many tests, how many failures, how many last moments before arrows flew or knives fell or whatever judgment these people delivered to those found wanting. The warriors formed a circle around the perimeter, their horses creating a living barrier, and Ethan dismounted when the others did, his legs stiff from 4 hours of riding, his body already feeling the accumulated stress of a night without sleep, followed by a morning of wondering when death would arrive and in what form. The air here felt different, heavier, charged with the weight of countless ceremonies performed in this exact spot. Countless judgments rendered countless men standing where Ethan now stood, facing tests they didn't understand, with stakes they couldn't fully grasp until the moment of reckoning arrived. This was sacred ground, and sacred ground had rules he didn't know. consequences he couldn't predict, a gravity that pulled at something deeper than flesh. Mangus dismounted and walked to the center of the arena, and Ethan saw him clearly for the first time, in full daylight, saw the man who would judge him, and found him exactly as terrifying as 400 warriors with drawn bows suggested he should be. 63 years old, but carrying those years the way mountains carried stone, as if age was just another kind of strength, another form of power that came from outlasting everything that tried to kill you. 6 feet 2 inches tall and 240 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, his bare chest revealing a map of combat written in raised white lines that crossed and recrossed like a complicated geography of violence survived. War paint marked his face in 3 thick red stripes that ran parallel across his features, the color of old blood. The symbol of 3 great battles won against odds that should have killed him, but hadn't, battles that had carved his reputation in stone and fear, and the respect of men who understood what it meant to stand when standing was the only option left. A headdress of eagle feathers marked him as someone important, a chief or war leader, someone whose word carried the weight of law and whose decisions shaped the futures of everyone who followed him. He spoke in his language, his voice carrying across the silence in a way that made the canyon walls seem to lean in to listen, formal and rhythmic, the words themselves incomprehensible to Ethan, but their purpose clear enough. This was pronouncement declaration, the reading of charges before a court whose verdict had likely been decided before the defendant ever arrived. When Mangus finished, he stepped back and waited, his eyes fixed on Ethan with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world because time itself bent to accommodate men like him. Kaya appeared at Ethan's side close enough that he could hear her breathing quick and shallow despite the controlled expression on her face, and when she spoke, her voice carried something that sounded almost like concern beneath the formal translation. The first test is endurance. You will be tied to the post. You will stand while the sun crosses the sky. You will not sit. You will not lean. You will not call out. She paused, and in that pause Ethan heard the weight of what came next. If you fall before the sun touches the western wall, you fail. Ethan looked up. The sun hung directly overhead, a white disk of fire that turned the whole sky into glare. Noon, and the western wall's shadow wouldn't reach the center of this arena until sunset, until the day had burned itself out and taken whatever it wanted from him in the process. 6 hours. 6 hours standing under Arizona sun in June, with temperatures climbing past 110 degrees, with his wrists bound behind a post, with no shade, no water, no mercy, no reprieve, except the one that came from endurance or death, whichever arrived first. Men had died from less. Men, younger than 40, stronger than 40 men who hadn't spent the last 9 years living like ghosts in the shell of their own lives. But refusing meant immediate death, a simpler kind, a faster kind, and at least accepting gave him a chance, however slim, however weighted against him the odds might be. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice, not trusting anything except the simple acknowledgement that he understood what was being asked and would try. The warriors moved with efficient brutality. No wasted motion, no unnecessary roughness, but no gentleness either. They bound his wrists behind the center post with rawhide rope, the leather wet and cold against his skin, and Ethan knew what that meant. As the rawhide dried in the sun, it would shrink, tightening its grip until his hands went numb, and then beyond numb into something worse, into the kind of pain that couldn't be ignored or endured, only survived. They positioned his feet shoulder-width apart and marked the ground around them with white powder lime or gypsum, drawing lines that defined the space he was allowed to occupy, the boundaries he couldn't cross without failing whatever test this was supposed to measure. "If you move your feet from those marks, you fail," Kaya said quietly, and something in her voice suggested she'd seen men fail this way before, seen them shift their weight wrong or stumble, or simply give up and step away from the pain into whatever consequences waited for failure. Then the warriors stepped back, creating distance, creating space for whatever would unfold in the next 6 hours, and Ethan was alone in the center of the circle with 400 pairs of eyes watching him with the intensity of people who'd come a long way to witness either justice or entertainment, or perhaps both. The sun felt like it was burning holes through his skull within the first 5 minutes. Sweat soaked his shirt, turning the fabric dark and heavy, clinging to his skin in a way that made breathing feel like work, made existing feel like labor. He had to consciously choose to continue performing. The position forced his chest forward and his shoulders back, making each breath a conscious effort, making the simple mechanics of respiration into something that required attention and will. His arms pulled backward around the post began to ache almost immediately. A dull throb that he knew from experience would only intensify as time passed, would grow from discomfort to pain, to agony, to something beyond agony, into a space where words failed and only endurance mattered. The warriors watched in silence. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply sat on their horses or stood in place and stared, tracking every twitch, every grimace, every moment of weakness, every sign that he was breaking under the weight of what they'd asked him to carry. Ethan focused on breathing, in through his nose, out through his mouth, trying to establish a rhythm that would carry him through what was coming, trying to find a cadence that matched his heartbeat, that matched the pulse of blood through veins that were already starting to protest the position they'd been forced into. An hour passed. Maybe 2. Time began to lose meaning under that merciless sun, began to stretch and compress in ways that made minutes feel like hours, and hours feel like minutes began to become something fluid and unreliable, something that couldn't be trusted to move forward at any consistent pace. Ethan's legs started to tremble. Small shakes, at first barely visible tremors he could control through sheer force of will and the stubborn refusal to show weakness. Then larger shakes, tremors that moved up through his thighs into his core, that made his whole body vibrate with the effort of remaining upright, of remaining still, of remaining within those white powder lines that defined the difference between passing and failing. His shoulders screamed for relief, the muscles burning as if someone had poured acid into the joints, as if the simple act of keeping his arms in position was slowly tearing the connective tissue that held bone to bone, that made movement possible, that allowed the human body to function as something other than a collection of parts held together by hope and habit. The rope around his wrists had cut into his skin, and he could feel blood trickling down his forearms, warm at first, and then sticky as it dried, mixing with sweat and dust to create a paste that itched and burned and couldn't be scratched, couldn't be relieved, couldn't be anything except another small agony added to the growing pile. Through the haze of heat and exhaustion, he saw Kaya watching from the front of the circle, her face showing nothing, giving away no emotion, no encouragement, no sympathy. But her hands gripped her horse's mane so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, blanched of color, and that small sign of tension was the only indication that she cared at all how this ended. She needed him to survive this. Her future depended on it, on proving to her father that her judgment about white men wasn't flawed, that allowing Ethan to help hadn't been weakness, but wisdom, and that thought became an anchor for him, something to hold on to when his own will started to waver. When his knees threatened to buckle, he thought about Kaya's words, "I need you to survive." When the pain in his shoulders turned into fire that consumed every other sensation he thought about, what failure meant not just for him, but for her. For the future, she'd lose if he quit. For the voice she'd never get to use in council. For the marriage she'd be forced into as punishment for being wrong about him. The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching into what felt like an hour, each hour compressing into a single eternal moment of suffering that had no beginning and promised no end. Ethan's vision began to blur at the edges, the world narrowing to a tunnel that showed him only what was directly in front of him, the rest fading into gray haze that might have been unconsciousness creeping closer, or might have been his brain trying to protect him from the full reality of what his body was experiencing. His mouth was so dry his tongue felt swollen too large for the space it occupied, thick and useless, and he understood that dehydration was setting in, that his body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve what little moisture remained, that he was approaching the point where choices would be made by biology rather than will. Flies landed on his face, crawling across his skin with their tiny insect feet, and he couldn't brush them away, couldn't do anything except blink when they crawled across his eyeball, the simple movement feeling like a defeat, even though he hadn't fallen, even though his feet remained planted in those white powder circles. He saw things that weren't there. Catherine standing in the circle, her belly swollen with the child she'd never deliver, her face pale with the pain that would eventually kill her, and she looked at him with eyes that held accusation and forgiveness in equal measure. "You let me die alone, Ethan," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, soft and patient, and carrying the weight of truth he'd spent 9 years trying to escape. "You held my hand, but you couldn't save me. You couldn't save our son. You couldn't save anyone." He blinked, and she was gone, replaced by empty air and dust and heat that shimmered like water that would never quench any thirst. He saw Daniel, the son who'd never drawn breath, a boy of maybe 12, playing in the dust with sticks and rocks, building something that looked like it might become a fort or might become nothing at all. The boy looked up, and his face was— Ethan's face was. Catherine's face was a blend of both that had never existed outside imagination and grief. "Daddy, why didn't you save us?" The question carried no malice, only curiosity, the kind that children brought to mysteries they didn't understand but wanted to figure out. Ethan blinked again, and the vision dissolved, leaving only the hard-packed earth and the awareness that his mind was starting to fracture under the strain, that reality was becoming negotiable, that the line between what was true and what he needed to be true was growing thinner with each moment that passed. Time collapsed into a single endless moment of suffering, where past and present merged into an eternal now that contained nothing except pain and the stubborn refusal to fall. Ethan stopped trying to fight. It stopped trying to resist or push back or maintain the separation between himself and what he was experiencing. Instead, he remembered something an old cavalry scout had told him years ago. A man who'd been captured by Apache and tortured for 3 days before managing to escape, a man who'd lived to tell about it, but wore the scars as permanent reminders of what the human body could survive if the human will refused to break. "Don't fight the pain," the scout had said, his eyes distant with memories he couldn't forget even when he wanted to. "Flow with it. Become it. It's the resistance that breaks you, not the pain itself. Pain is just sensation, just information your body is sending. It's the fighting against it, the trying to make it stop, that tears you apart." So Ethan stopped resisting. He let the pain wash through him like a river, let it fill every space in his body until there was nothing left but the sensation and the stubborn refusal to fall. He synchronized his breathing with the slight movement of the post against his back, matching its rhythm, becoming part of the wood and the earth and the burning sun overhead. He became the pain instead of fighting it, became the heat instead of trying to escape it, became the moment instead of wishing for it to end, and in that, becoming something shifted. The suffering didn't stop, didn't lessen, didn't become easier to bear, but it became something he could exist alongside rather than something he had to overcome. An old warrior, the same one who'd spoken earlier about being proven at 23, suddenly stood from where he'd been sitting and walked to the edge of the arena facing Ethan. His name, Ethan would learn later, was Chayton, and he carried 67 years with the dignity of someone who'd earned every one of them through survival that should have been impossible. Chayton sat cross-legged in the dirt and began chanting the sound, low and rhythmic, wordless, but somehow full of meaning. A vocalization that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than throat or chest, seemed to emerge from the ground itself, or from the air, or from the collective memory of everyone who'd ever stood where Ethan stood and endured what he was enduring. Within moments, 3 other older warriors joined him, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to fill the canyon, seemed to wrap around Ethan like a blanket that didn't ease the pain, but somehow made it more bearable, made it feel like something shared rather than something born alone. Some of the younger warriors frowned at this shifting uncomfortably in their saddles, and one of them, a man about 28 with an ambitious gleam in his eye and war paint that suggested he was eager to prove himself worthy of higher status, spoke sharply to Chayton in Apache, the words harsh and clipped with disapproval. But the elder ignored him, continuing to chant, continuing to offer whatever support this represented. And after a moment the younger man fell silent, unable or unwilling to challenge the authority that came from age and experience, and the respect that men like Chayton had earned through decades of survival. Ethan didn't understand what was happening, didn't know what the chanting meant or why it had started or what it represented in the context of this test, but he felt something shift in the atmosphere, felt the weight of judgment lighten by the smallest measure, felt less alone in his suffering, even though nothing had physically changed. The shadow of the western wall began its slow creep across the arena floor, moving with the kind of patience that only geological time understood, inch by inch. Like honey crawling through winter cold, like inevitability made visible, like hope given form. Ethan watched it with the desperate focus of a drowning man, watching a rope being lowered with a tension that excluded everything else, with the awareness that this shadow represented the difference between survival and failure, between proving himself worthy and dying in disgrace. His knees were locked, now locked so tight he wasn't sure he'd ever be able to unlock them. Locked in a way that made him wonder if the damage being done was permanent, if he'd walk away from this, assuming he walked away at all, with legs that still worked the way they were supposed to. His entire body shook with exhaustion and pain, and the massive effort of simply remaining upright, of refusing to let gravity have what it wanted of standing, when every cell in his body screamed that falling would be mercy. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime compressed into a single afternoon, after what measured by clock might have been 6 hours, but measured by suffering felt like 6 years, the shadow touched the white powder line around his left foot. Mangus stood abruptly, the movement sudden enough to pull Ethan's wandering attention back to the present, back to the moment, back to the awareness that whatever was about to happen would determine whether the last 6 hours had been endurance or merely prelude to death. The chief walked toward Ethan with measured steps, each one deliberate, each one carrying the weight of judgment about to be rendered, and Ethan thought with the part of his mind that could still form coherent thoughts. This is it. This is the moment I learn whether I've succeeded or failed, whether I've earned the right to continue breathing, or whether the next breath will be my last. Mangus drew his knife, the same obsidian blade he'd driven into the ground the day before the one that had marked the beginning of this trial. And Ethan's exhausted mind couldn't process what was about to happen, couldn't determine whether this was execution or release, couldn't do anything except watch with vision that kept fading in and out of focus. The knife rose, and for a moment Ethan thought he'd misunderstood everything, thought that passing meant dying with honor instead of dying with shame, thought that the reward for endurance was a quick death instead of a slow one. Then the blade came down and cut through the rawhide ropes in one smooth motion, the leather parting with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence, and Ethan's arms fell forward, released from the position they'd held for 6 hours, and the relief was so intense it was almost sexual. A rush of sensation that made his vision go white for a moment, made everything else disappear into the pure physical ecstasy of pressure, released of torture, ended of freedom granted to flesh that had forgotten what freedom felt like. His knees unlocked, and his whole body swayed like a tree in a strong wind, like a structure whose foundation had been compromised, like something on the edge of collapse, and 400 warriors leaned forward collectively to see if he would fall now after everything in the final moment when the test was technically over. But the proving wasn't quite complete. Ethan locked his knees one more time, locked them with the last reserves of strength he had locked them with will that came from somewhere beyond muscle or bone or the physical capacity of flesh, and remained standing. Barely standing, swaying like drunk, but standing. Mangus spoke a single word loud enough for everyone to hear, a word Ethan didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in what happened next. The warriors erupted not with hostility, but with something that sounded like approval, like celebration, like acknowledgement of something witnessed and found worthy. They cheered, striking their spear butts against the ground in a rhythmic pounding that made the earth tremble beneath Ethan's feet, that created a percussion of validation that announced to anyone listening that whatever had just happened, it had been accepted as sufficient. Even the young, ambitious warrior who'd questioned Chaitin's chanting was striking his spear against the ground, now caught up in the collective acknowledgement of what they'd just witnessed, unable to hold himself apart from the moment, even if his pride wanted him to. Kaya's face flooded with relief so profound she couldn't hide it, couldn't maintain the careful neutrality she'd shown for the last 6 hours. Tears welled in her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall, blinking rapidly to clear them, refusing to show that much vulnerability, even in victory, even in the moment when what she'd gambled everything on had paid off in the only currency that mattered. She translated her father's word, her voice trembling slightly with emotion she was trying and failing to suppress. "You have passed the first test, but understand this, what comes next is harder. The second test does not measure your body, it measures your judgment, and men with strong bodies often have weak minds." Back on the New Mexico porch, Wyatt was crying, the tears running down his face to mix with the afternoon heat, to disappear into shirt fabric, to mark this moment as one that mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. "You stood for 6 hours. The question came out choked with emotion, with something that looked like pride and felt like the beginning of understanding what strength really meant. "I did, boy. And I wanted to fall every single minute, wanted to quit, wanted to give up, wanted to let my knees buckle and my body collapse and just be done with the pain." Ethan's voice was gentle understanding, carrying no judgment for the question or the tears. "But I remembered your grandmother's words. Don't quit. I remembered that quitting would mean dying, not just in body, but in spirit, would mean proving that I wasn't worth saving, wasn't worth the effort she'd put into trying to make me better than I was." Wyatt wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving smears across his face that made him look younger and older at the same time. "Is that what I should do? Not quit when those boys hurt me?" "Exactly." Ethan leaned forward, his weathered hands taking Wyatt's smaller ones, holding them with a gentleness that 68 years of hard living hadn't managed to destroy. "They want you to fall, to feel small, to believe that being different makes you less than them. But if you stand even when you're shaking, even when you're scared, even when every part of you wants to run away or hide or quit, you prove you're stronger than they'll ever be. You prove that their words and their fists can't break. What matters can't touch the part of you that knows who you are and refuses to be ashamed of it." The boy nodded slowly, something shifting in his posture and the way he held himself in the set of his shoulders that suggested he was hearing more than words, was receiving something that went deeper than advice. "Endurance isn't about not feeling pain, Wyatt. It's about feeling the pain and standing anyway. Your Apache blood doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong enough to endure what would break lesser men, what would send boys who only know comfort running for safety the first time life gets hard." Wyatt sat taller, the bruise on his cheek suddenly seeming less important, less defining, less like a mark of shame, and more like evidence that he'd stood his ground against something that wanted to push him down. "Tell me about Test 2, Grandpa." Ethan smiled, the expression carrying warmth that softened the hard edges of his face, that made him look less like a man carved from desert stone and more like someone who remembered what it meant to hope. "Test 2 taught me something different. It taught me that the strongest choice isn't always the selfish one, that wisdom sometimes means giving away what you need most, that understanding what matters requires seeing beyond your own pain to recognize the pain of others." Ethan was allowed to collapse after the rope was cut, though even that was a controlled fall, a sitting rather than a sprawling, a maintenance of some shred of dignity, even in exhaustion, that went deeper than muscle or bone. His hands were still bound in front of him now, repositioned but not freed, a reminder that he wasn't fully trusted yet, that passing one test didn't mean the proving was complete. A woman warrior, Her face lined with age and wisdom approached with a leather water skin, and she allowed Ethan one small sip, no more, and when he looked at her questioningly, she said something sharp in Apache that carried the tone of command even if the words were incomprehensible. Kaya translated her voice, still carrying the tremor of relief not quite under control. "Drink too much too fast, you vomit. Then you fail the next trial." The woman examined Ethan's wrists, which were cut deep enough to need attention. The rawhide, having done exactly what he'd known it would do, had shrunk as it dried and cut through skin to find the bone beneath. She applied a paste that smelled of yarrow and other herbs. Ethan couldn't identify plants that grew in places white men didn't know to look, used in ways white men hadn't learned, carrying healing in their cells that medicine purchased in Wilcox couldn't match. She wrapped the wounds in clean cloth, her movements efficient and sure, the touch of someone who'd done this many times before, who'd tended wounds that mattered and wounds that didn't, and had learned to tell the difference. She said nothing, but nodded once before walking away, and Ethan understood that this was respect hard-earned and grudgingly given, the acknowledgement that he'd proven something worth acknowledging, even if words weren't necessary to mark the moment. Mangus spoke again, and Kaya moved closer to translate her proximity, a small comfort in a situation that offered little of that commodity. "My father says you have passed the first trial with honor. Your body proved strong enough, surprising for a man of 40 years. She paused, and Ethan heard the shift in her tone, the warning beneath the words. "But body is easy, mind is harder. Rest 20 minutes, then the second trial begins." 20 minutes wasn't enough to recover from 6 hours of torture, and Ethan knew that was the point. Knew they were testing whether he could endure again immediately, or whether that first trial had emptied his reserves completely, had taken everything he had, and left nothing for what came next. He sat in the dirt, focusing on breathing, on letting his heart rate slow, on preparing himself mentally for whatever came next, because physical preparation was beyond his capacity at this point, was something his body simply couldn't provide, no matter how much will he applied. The second warrior stepped forward, carrying the clay vessel that had been sealed with beeswax, and he broke the seal with ceremonial care, the movement suggesting ritual, suggesting that what was about to happen had been done this way for long enough that the how mattered as much as the what. A smell wafted across the arena, cutting through dust and sweat and the lingering scent of his own fear. Water, fresh, clean mountain spring water, and Ethan's cracked lips ached at the scent of it, his parched throat constricting with need, his entire body screaming for moisture with an intensity that was almost painful in itself. But as the warrior tilted the vessel and poured its contents onto the thirsty ground, where the water vanished in seconds, like it had never existed at all, Ethan understood with sudden clarity that this was the trap, that this wasn't about whether he was thirsty, but about something else entirely, something deeper and more dangerous than physical need. Kaya's voice cut through his confusion, providing context that made the stakes clear. The second trial is not about pain. It is about choice. She looked at him with those dark eyes that held too much knowledge, too much understanding of how men failed when the tests moved beyond simple endurance. Do you take or do you give? Choose correctly and you pass. Choose wrong and you die. But no one will tell you which is correct. The warrior held the empty vessel toward Ethan, offering it in a gesture that seemed simple, but carried the weight of life and death, and Ethan, exhausted and dehydrated and desperate, had to decide what the right answer was when every instinct in his body was screaming at him to take what was being offered to drink, to satisfy the need that had become the center of his entire existence. His first thought was pure biology, pure survival instinct operating at a level below conscious thought. Take the water, drink, live. The imperative was so strong it felt like gravity, like a force that couldn't be resisted, like the inevitable conclusion to a question that had only one possible answer. But something held him back. Some instinct born of watching these people, of understanding that nothing they did was without layers of meaning. He couldn't immediately see, without purposes that ran deeper than surface explanations, without tests, within tests, within tests. He forced himself to think past the desperation, to look beyond the obvious, to observe what was actually happening, instead of what his body wanted to be happening. His eyes scanned the circle of faces, young warriors sweating in the heat, their horses stamping restlessly in the afternoon sun. Older men whose weathered skin showed the toll of decades in this brutal climate, whose eyes carried the weight of too many summers survived and too many brothers buried. They'd all ridden for 4 hours to get here. They'd all sat through 6 more hours in the blazing sun, watching him suffer, bearing witness to his trial. 10 hours. 10 hours without water in 100-degree heat, and in all that time, Ethan realized with dawning understanding he hadn't seen a single one of them drink. 10 hours of self-imposed deprivation undertaken willingly as part of witnessing his trial, shared suffering that spoke to something fundamental about who these people were and what they valued. They'd imposed on themselves the same thirst they'd imposed on him, and they'd done it not because they had to, but because collective experience mattered more than individual comfort, because bearing witness meant more than watching from safety, because this was a culture where the group's well-being took precedence over personal need. That kind of discipline, that kind of shared sacrifice spoke to values that Ethan recognized from his own past, from Tennessee before the war, from communities that understood survival, meant cooperation, meant thinking beyond yourself, meant putting the whole above the parts. He thought back to his homesteading days, to the drought of 1881, when wells ran dry across the territory and neighbors had to share what little water they had or watch everyone die together. He remembered Patterson, a settler who'd hoarded his well water while everyone else shared, who'd thought that keeping what was his would save him, while ignoring that isolation meant death in a land where cooperation was the only thing standing between people and the desert's patient hunger. Within a month, the community had shunned. Patterson had stopped trading with him, had stopped acknowledging his existence, had created a social death that was worse than physical death because it meant living but not belonging, breathing but not being part of the web that made survival possible. Patterson had left Arizona Territory by autumn, driven out not by violence, but by the simple refusal of decent people to associate with someone who thought only of himself, who valued his own comfort over the collective good, who'd broken the unspoken contract that bound communities together. Catherine had taught him something during those hard months, had shared wisdom that came from growing up in Tennessee during the war, from seeing what happened when communities fell apart, when it became every man for himself, when the bonds that held people together dissolved under pressure and left nothing but chaos and death. "In the desert, water shared is life," she'd told him one night as they lay in bed listening to the wind scrape against the walls. "Water hoarded is death for everyone, because the man who hoards eventually realizes he can't defend his well against everyone who needs it, can't survive alone what can only be survived together." Ethan's hand trembled as he reached out, every nerve ending, screaming for him to take the vessel, to lift it to his lips, to drink until the thirst was quenched and the need was satisfied. But instead of taking it, instead of claiming what his body demanded, he pushed it gently back toward the warrior, the movement requiring more strength than standing for 6 hours had taken, requiring a different kind of endurance, the kind that meant choosing against instinct, against need, against the voice in his head that said survival meant taking care of yourself first. His voice came out as a rasp, barely audible, rough as sandpaper on wood. "Give it to them." He gestured with his bound hands toward the circle of warriors watching toward the men who'd ridden far and waited long and imposed on themselves the same deprivation he'd suffered. They rode far. They waited long. Their thirst matters too. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The warrior holding the vessel looked shocked, as if this was not the response he'd expected, or perhaps had ever witnessed before, as if Ethan had just done something that broke the pattern, that violated the expectations, that made the outcome uncertain in ways it hadn't been uncertain before. Then a murmur rippled through the assembled warriors, like wind moving through grass, like a wave spreading outward from a stone dropped in still water. And Ethan watched as some of them nodded slowly, as if confirming something they'd hoped to see but hadn't dared to expect, as if he'd just answered a question he hadn't known was being asked. Chaitin, the old warrior who'd chanted during the first trial, struck his chest with his closed fist in a gesture that needed no translation, a sign of respect that carried weight because it came from someone who'd earned the right to give or withhold such acknowledgement. Others followed suit, even some of the younger warriors who'd seemed skeptical, their fists striking chest creating a rhythm that echoed off the canyon walls, a percussion that announced approval that marked this moment as significant. The sound filled the valley like thunder, like drums, like the heartbeat of 400 men recognizing something they understood at a level deeper than words, something that spoke to shared values, to common understanding, to the bedrock principles that held communities together across time and culture. Mangus stood and walked toward Ethan, studying him with new intensity, and when he spoke, his tone had changed in subtle ways, less judge and more teacher, as if Ethan had graduated from one category to another, in the chief's mind had moved from defendant to something approaching equal. Kaya translated, and Ethan could hear the relief threading through her voice like gold-veining quartz. "You have proven you understand the second law. A man who thinks only of himself dies alone in the desert. A man who thinks of others first will never thirst because others will remember his sacrifice and care for him in turn." The warrior who'd offered the vessel raised it high so everyone could see a gesture that announced what came next, and then took a long drink himself before passing it to the warrior beside him. Ethan watched the vessel make the entire circuit, each man taking only 2 or 3 swallows, disciplined, even in their thirst, sharing equally, until the vessel returned empty to the center of the arena, proof that even in relief they maintained the principles they'd tested him on, that what they demanded of others, they demanded first of themselves. A different warrior refilled the vessel from a larger water bag and brought it to Ethan, and this time when it was offered, Ethan understood he was allowed to drink, that the test had been passed, that the water was now his to claim, because he'd proven he understood when to give and when to take, when to sacrifice and when to accept. He took 3 careful swallows, fighting the urge to gulp it all down, fighting the instinct to drink until the thirst was completely quenched, knowing that restraint mattered as much as the earlier choice, that how he received this gift was being watched as closely as how he'd refused the earlier offer. The water was cool and sweet, the best thing he'd ever tasted, and those 3 swallows felt like salvation, like mercy, like the universe acknowledging that sometimes the right choice got rewarded even when the right choice felt like punishment. On the New Mexico porch in 1920, Wyatt was processing something that seemed to be shifting the ground beneath his understanding, reorganizing how he thought about strength and sacrifice and what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. "So you gave away the water even though you needed it?" The question carried wonder, carried confusion, carried the struggle of a 10-year-old mind trying to wrap itself around a concept that defied the simple logic of self-preservation. "I did, boy, because I saw they needed it too, and I understood something I'd forgotten in 9 years of living alone." Ethan's voice was patient, carrying the weight of wisdom earned through trial. "In a community, no one survives alone. The water I gave away came back to me multiplied, came back because I'd proven I understood that my survival was tied to theirs, that we rise or fall together. That isolation is the real death, even when your body keeps breathing." Wyatt's face showed the concentration of someone working through a problem that mattered, that had implications beyond the story, that spoke to his own situation in ways he was only beginning to articulate. "Is that why you stayed with the Apache? Because they understood sharing?" "Partly, but also because they taught me something I'd forgotten in my grief, something Catherine had tried to teach me, but I'd been too buried in my own pain to hear." Ethan leaned back in his rocking chair, the motion suggesting comfort, suggesting ease, suggesting that even talking about hard things could happen in spaces that felt safe. "They taught me that being part of something bigger than yourself gives life meaning, that connecting to others isn't weakness, but the only real strength there is, that we're not meant to carry our burdens alone, but to share them with people who understand what it means to endure." He paused, letting that sink in, letting Wyatt's mind work through the implications, and then continued with the kind of directness that came from knowing the boy needed to hear this, needed to understand what was being offered. Those boys at school, Wyatt, they're trying to make you feel alone, trying to convince you that being different means being less than, means not belonging anywhere. But here's the truth, they don't understand, and you need to learn. Being different doesn't make you belong to less. It makes you belong to more. You belong to your father's family, and you belong to your grandmother's people. You carry two cultures, two wisdoms, two ways of seeing the world. That makes you richer than those boys, not poorer. That makes you a bridge, and bridges connect things that need connecting. Wyatt nodded slowly, and something in his expression suggested that the message was landing, was taking root, was beginning to change how he thought about the bruise on his face and what it represented. "What was the third test?" "Grandpa?" Ethan's face grew serious. The lightness that had crept in during the discussion of the second test fading into something heavier, something that carried the weight of harder truths. The third test was the hardest, boy, because it wasn't about body or mind. It was about facing the truth of who I really was, about admitting the worst parts of myself, about standing naked before judgment and hoping that honesty would be enough to save me when lies would have been so much easier. Mangus spoke again, and Kaya translated her voice, carrying the solemnity that came from understanding what was at stake in this final trial. "You have passed 2 trials. Body and mind both proved worthy. But the third trial is the one that matters most. It reveals what a man truly values, what he would sacrifice, what lives in his heart beneath all the words and actions we use to hide our true selves from the world." Her voice dropped lower, became more intimate, as if sharing a secret that the canyon walls might hear and remember. "Many men have strong bodies. Some have wise minds. Few have pure hearts. And this is where most men fail, where strength and wisdom aren't enough, where only truth can save you, and lies will kill you, no matter how convincing they sound." The third warrior stepped forward, carrying the cloth bundle that had been mentioned when the trials were first announced, and he unwrapped it slowly, with the reverence people reserve for sacred objects or the bones of ancestors. His movements careful and deliberate, suggesting that what lay inside held significance beyond its physical form. Inside was a knife, and even from a distance Ethan could see it was extraordinary in ways that transcended function, that spoke of artistry and love and patience, that measured time in seasons rather than hours. The blade was 9 inches of polished obsidian black volcanic glass, knapped by a master craftsman into something so sharp it could split hair, so perfectly balanced it felt alive in the hand, so beautiful it seemed wrong to imagine it cutting flesh, when it clearly belonged in places where beauty mattered more than violence. The handle was wrapped in soft deerskin worked smooth as silk, and into the wrapping was beadwork so intricate it must have taken months to complete, turquoise and red coral and white shell arranged in patterns that told stories Ethan couldn't read, but could recognize as significant, as meaningful, as carrying weight beyond decoration. The sheath was fringed deerskin painted with symbols that seemed to glow in the afternoon light, and the whole object radiated the kind of beauty that comes from months or years of painstaking labor, from love made tangible, from devotion given form. This wasn't a weapon. This was art. This was love transformed into object, into something that could be held and touched and passed down through generations as proof that beauty could exist in a world that often felt like it contained nothing but hardship. Mangus took the knife from the warrior and held it with a tenderness that transformed his face from stone to something achingly human, something vulnerable, something that suggested the weight he carried went deeper than leadership, deeper than responsibility, deep into the places where personal loss lived and never quite healed. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, and Ethan heard grief in it. Old grief that had never fully resolved, the kind that becomes part of who you are rather than something you get over. Kaya's voice broke slightly as she translated her own emotion bleeding through, despite efforts to remain neutral, to serve as bridge rather than participant. "This knife belonged to my wife, Takana Swift Bird. She made it herself over 8 moons obsidian from the sacred quarry 40 miles north where our people have gathered stone since before memory began. Each bead was traded from different tribes across hundreds of miles journeys undertaken for the sole purpose of gathering beauty, of creating something that would last beyond her life. She made it as a gift for me on our marriage day, and I gave it back to her as a gift when Kaya was born, so our daughter would always have something of both of us would carry proof that she came from love. Kaya's voice broke completely then, and she had to pause, had to gather herself, had to swallow against tears that threatened to spill despite her best efforts, and when she continued, Ethan could hear the rawness of wounds that hadn't healed even after 14 years. 14 winters ago, cavalry raided our winter camp. Buffalo soldiers from Fort Apache coming at dawn when we were sleeping, when we were vulnerable, when we thought ourselves safe because treaties had been signed and promises had been made. Takana was protecting me. I was 14. A soldier shot her, and she fell on top of me, shielding me with her body, even as she was dying, making sure that whatever happened to her, I would survive. She died so I could live. The words hung in the air like smoke, like ghosts, like evidence of crimes that could never be prosecuted because the law didn't recognize Apache mothers as people worth protecting, didn't count their deaths as murders worth investigating, didn't acknowledge that love and sacrifice and heroism existed on both sides of every conflict. This knife is the only thing I have of her. It is her hands, her voice, her love made permanent. I would die before losing. It would give my life to keep this last piece of her in the world. Mangus placed the knife on the ground in front of Ethan, the obsidian blade catching the afternoon light and throwing it back in ways that made it seem to glow from within. And when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of the trap closing of choices, narrowing of stakes, rising to heights that transcended simple survival. Kaya translated, and Ethan heard in her voice the understanding that this was the moment everything depended on, the test that would determine not just his fate, but hers as well. Yesterday, this knife was in my travois. You fixed the travois. You could have seen it, could have known what it was worth, could have taken it and left me stranded in the desert with nothing. You didn't. But maybe only because you didn't know its value, didn't know who I was or what it meant, didn't understand that this single object was worth more than everything you owned combined. The question came like a blade sliding between ribs, precise and deadly. So I ask you this, Ethan Caldwell. If you had known who Kaya was yesterday, if you had known this knife was there in her travois, would you have helped her? Or would you have taken the knife and left her stranded in the desert to die? Ethan's mind reeled, searching for the right answer, for the response that would save him, for the words that would prove he was worthy of trust. But every option led to death. If he said he would have helped anyway, they'd call him a liar because men were selfish and everyone knew it, because claiming nobility when there was no way to prove it was the refuge of people who wanted credit for virtue they didn't possess. If he said he would have taken the knife, he was admitting to being a thief, someone who preyed on the vulnerable, someone whose help came with prices too high to pay. If he said he didn't know, he was a coward, avoiding the question, trying to escape judgment by claiming uncertainty, proving that he lacked the courage to own his own choices. The words would not be heard until the next part. Ethan thought about his past selves, about the different versions of Ethan Caldwell who had existed at different moments, shaped by different circumstances, carrying different wounds, making different choices based on who he'd been at the time rather than who he wished he'd been or who he claimed to be. At 28, newly arrived in Arizona with Catherine, and hope he'd been generous, idealistic, still believing that doing the right thing mattered because the universe kept score and rewarded virtue. He'd found a Mexican farmer's lost money pouch, once $35, which was more than a month's wages, and he'd returned it without hesitation, without even considering keeping it, because that's what decent people did, and he'd still believed he was a decent person. But that was before loss, before cynicism, before the world had taught him that kindness was a luxury. Poor men couldn't afford that. Generosity got you killed in a land where survival was measured in how little you gave away rather than how much you shared. After Catherine died, after he'd spent 18 hours watching her slip away, despite every prayer he'd never believed in but offered anyway, Ethan had changed. The generous idealist had died with her, had been buried in that grave alongside Catherine, and the son who'd never drawn breath, and what crawled out of that hole was something harder, angrier, more interested in surviving than in being good. 5 years ago he'd ridden past the Williams family being attacked, had heard the shots, seen the smoke rising from their homestead, known that people were dying while he kept his horse pointed toward safety. It wasn't his problem, wasn't his fight, wasn't worth the risk of dying for people who were already probably dead by the time he could reach them anyway. He'd learned 2 days later that the entire family had been killed. Jack Williams, who'd been the closest thing to a friend Ethan had allowed himself in those early years. Mary Williams, who'd brought him soup when he was sick and never asked for anything in return. Emma and Thomas Jr., 8 and 6 years old, who'd never hurt anyone, who'd never had the chance to grow up and find out who they might have become. 4 people dead while Ethan rode past, and he'd lived with that guilt every day since, had carried it like stones in his pockets, had felt its weight every time he told himself he'd made the right choice. The smart choice, the choice that kept him breathing, even if it made breathing feel like theft. 3 years ago, he'd found an abandoned settler wagon, the owner dead or fled, and he'd taken the tools from it. Good tools worth maybe $80 a hammer and saw and rope that he'd used to maintain his farm that he'd picked up every day since, and hated himself a little more each time because he knew they'd been stolen, knew they belonged to someone else, knew that taking them made him exactly the kind of man he'd once despised. So which Ethan would have stopped to help Kaya, if he'd known who she was and what she carried. The young idealist who believed in doing right. The bitter widower who'd learned that kindness got you killed. The guilty coward who took what he could and lived with shame as the price of survival. Ethan honestly didn't know. And that uncertainty was more damning than any lie, would have been more revealing than any truth he could construct, because it meant he didn't trust himself, didn't believe his own character was solid enough to predict, didn't think he was fundamentally good enough to guarantee the right choice. He looked at Mangus, at Kaya, at the circle of warriors waiting for his answer, waiting to hear what kind of man stood before them, and he said the only thing he could say, the only truth that mattered, even if it damned him. I cannot answer that question. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Warriors erupted in shouts, some jumping to their feet, hands moving to weapons, the careful structure of the ceremony collapsing into chaos. The young, ambitious warrior Ethan had noticed earlier, the one whose name he'd learned was Dakota, stepped forward with his hand on his tomahawk, his face twisted with something that looked like righteous anger mixed with vindication. He refuses the question. Dakota's voice carried across the valley, sharp and accusing. He admits guilt by silence. This is the answer of a man who knows he would have stolen, who knows he would have left her to die, who refuses to speak the truth because the truth condemns him. Other voices joined in, some angry, some confused, and Ethan saw the fragile peace he'd built through 2 trials shattering like glass, saw death approaching, not as arrows in sunlight, but as mob justice, as collective rage, as 400 men deciding he'd failed and administering the consequence. Mangus's face darkened like storm clouds gathering, and Ethan knew he was 1 word away from execution, 1 moment away from arrows flying, 1 heartbeat away from learning what dying felt like when you'd come so close to living. Kaya looked stricken, her face pale beneath the dust and heat, and Ethan saw in her eyes the recognition that she'd gambled everything on him, and he'd just failed her, had just proven her father right, had just cost her the future she'd been fighting for. But Ethan kept talking, raising his voice above the chaos, refusing to let them drown him out before he could explain, refusing to die with words unsaid that might make the difference between meaning and meaninglessness. I cannot answer because I will never be that man again. His voice cut through the noise like a blade, sharp enough to draw blood, loud enough to demand attention. The one who didn't know who you were, who stopped yesterday in ignorance, who made his choice without understanding the stakes or the consequences or what it meant. The warriors quieted, slightly more confused now than angry, trying to understand what he was saying, trying to figure out if this was wisdom or just clever words meant to disguise cowardice. Ethan pressed on, knowing he had seconds before they stopped listening, before confusion turned back to anger, before the moment was lost and couldn't be recovered. Today I know who Kaya is. I know about Takana. I know about this knife and what it means and what it cost, and why losing it would be like losing her all over again. The Ethan Caldwell standing here now is not the same man who stopped yesterday. We're never the same person we were yesterday. Every choice we make, everything we learn, it changes us. We become someone new with each decision, with each piece of knowledge, with each moment that forces us to see the world differently than we saw it before. He took a breath, his bound hands reaching for the knife on the ground between them, the obsidian blade cold and smooth against his skin, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. So I can't tell you what yesterday's Ethan would have done if he'd known about the knife. Maybe he would have taken it. Maybe he would have left Kaya stranded in the desert and ridden away with treasure he didn't earn and didn't deserve. Maybe he would have been exactly the kind of man you think all white men are. I honestly don't know. And claiming I do would be a lie, would be me pretending I'm better than I am, would be me asking for credit I haven't earned. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the canyon, and Ethan knew this was the moment, knew that what he said next would determine everything. But I can tell you what today's Ethan would do, knowing everything I know now, knowing who you are and what this means and what's at stake, knowing that this knife is all that's left of a woman who died protecting her daughter, who gave her life so Kaya could live, who poured 8 months of love into creating something beautiful in a world that offers mostly ugliness. He held the knife out toward Kaya, his hands trembling with exhaustion and emotion and the weight of truth being spoken in a place that had heard too many lies. I would help you again. I would help you even if it cost my life, even if stopping meant dying, even if kindness meant sacrifice, because some things matter more than survival. Because I'm tired of being the man who rides past people in trouble, who chooses safety over decency, who lives with shame as the price of breathing. Because maybe this is my chance to stop living with guilt and start living with purpose. Because maybe this is how I become someone my wife would have been proud of instead of someone I'm ashamed to remember. The knife trembled in his outstretched hands, catching light, throwing it back, becoming something more than metal and stone, becoming symbol, becoming bridge, becoming the difference between who he'd been and who he might become. Take it. It's yours. It was always yours. And if you judge me worthy, if your father judges me worthy, maybe I can finally be the man I should have been 5 years ago when I rode past that family and let them die. Maybe I can be someone who stands instead of runs, who helps instead of hides, who chooses right, even when right is hard. The silence stretched like leather drying in sun, tightening around them, and then Kaya stepped forward slowly, each step deliberate, each movement carrying weight, and she took the knife from his hands with fingers that brushed his. For just a moment, contact that felt electric, that felt like connection, that felt like understanding, passing between people who'd started as strangers and become something else through trial and truth. Tears ran freely down her face now, no attempt to hide them, no effort to maintain the careful neutrality she'd shown for hours. She turned to her father and spoke in Apache, her voice clear and strong despite the emotion, and whatever she said made several of the older warriors nod thoughtfully, made Chaitin strike his chest again with that gesture of respect, made something shift in the atmosphere from judgment to possibility. Mangus took the knife from his daughter and examined it as if seeing it for the first time, running his fingers over the beadwork his dead wife had made, over the deerskin she'd softened, over the obsidian she'd shaped with patience and love and the kind of devotion that transcended death. When he looked up at Ethan, his eyes held something new, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he'd finally seen past the white skin and settler's clothes to something deeper underneath, something that mattered more than surface differences. The chief spoke at length, his words carrying across the valley with the weight of formal pronouncement. And when he finished, several warriors struck their chests in that salute, and the sound echoed off canyon walls like approval-made percussion, like acknowledgement transformed into rhythm. Kaya translated, and Ethan heard wonder in her voice, threading through relief like gold through quartz. "My father says you have answered the question no man has answered correctly. Others have claimed they would help, and we knew they lied, knew they were telling us what they thought we wanted to hear rather than what was true. Others have admitted they would steal, and we killed them for honesty, without honor, for being truthful about being evil, for proving they understood right and wrong but chose wrong anyway." She paused, making sure he heard what came next, making sure he understood the significance. "But you said something new, something we have never heard before in all the years we have tested men in this valley. You said you don't know who you were, but you know who you are. You said we are not prisoners of our past selves, not trapped by the choices we made yesterday, not defined forever by our worst moments. That every sunrise we can choose to be a different man than we were the day before. That change is possible. That redemption is real. That becoming better is something we can do rather than something we can only wish for." Mangus handed the knife back to Kaya with a gesture that seemed to carry deep meaning, seemed to be saying something about trust and vindication and the passing of judgment from negative to positive. And then he turned to face the assembled warriors and raised both hands high above his head. He spoke in a voice that rang off the canyon walls like a bell, formal and final, announcing verdict, declaring judgment, making official what had been tested and found acceptable. The warriors responded as one, their voices joining in a single word repeated 3 times. Ho, 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 the sacred number, the completion, the acknowledgement that something significant had been witnessed and approved. Then they dismounted and struck their spear butts into the ground in a rhythmic pounding that made the earth beneath Ethan's feet tremble like a living thing, like the planet itself was participating in this moment, like the desert that had watched men fail for generations was acknowledging that someone had finally passed. Kaya moved closer to Ethan, close enough that he could hear her whisper beneath the drumming of spears against earth. "You have passed all 3 trials. My father declares you proven, a man of true heart who acted without knowing the stakes, who would act the same way, knowing everything, who chose truth over safety, and became worthy through that choosing." The relief in her voice was palpable, but Ethan could see that her shoulders were still tense, as if she didn't quite believe the ordeal was over, as if she expected one more test, one more trial, one more moment when everything could still fall apart. She was right to be tense. One warrior remained mounted while all the others had dismounted in celebration. Dakota sat on his horse with his jaw set and his eyes burning with something that looked like righteous anger barely contained. And he didn't cheer, didn't strike his spear against the ground, didn't join in the collective acknowledgement of what they'd just witnessed. He simply waited until the celebration died down, until the noise faded into expectant silence, until every eye had turned to see why this one man refused to participate, and then he spoke in English so there could be no misunderstanding, so Ethan would know exactly what was being said and why. He has passed 3 trials of single moments, moments that lasted hours, yes, but moments nonetheless. Choices made in the space of a day, decisions that required endurance and wisdom and truth, but only for the span of time it takes the sun to cross the sky. Dakota's voice carried across the valley, sharp and challenging. "But I have a 4th question, a question about lifetimes rather than moments, a question about years of choices rather than hours of testing." The warriors who had been celebrating fell silent, the shift so sudden it felt like a physical thing, like the air pressure changing before a storm, and Mangus turned slowly to look at Dakota, his expression unreadable, caught between the ceremony he'd just completed and this new challenge he couldn't easily refuse without appearing weak, without suggesting that the proving was less than complete. Kaya stiffened beside Ethan, drawing a sharp breath that spoke of fear of recognition, that this wasn't part of the ceremony, wasn't something Mangus had planned, wasn't something that could be predicted or controlled. Dakota dismounted with deliberate slowness, making a show of it, making sure everyone understood this was his moment, his challenge, his right to question what others had accepted. He was perhaps 28 years old, powerfully built, with the kind of musculature that came from constant physical activity from a life spent hunting and fighting and surviving in a land that killed the weak without mercy. Combat scars marked his chest and arms, raised white lines that mapped a history of violence endured and survived that announced to anyone looking that this was not a man to be taken lightly. His war paint was fresh and aggressive, all sharp angles and harsh lines, the kind that spoke of youth and ambition, of someone eager to prove himself worthy of higher status, of a warrior who wanted recognition and saw this moment as his chance to claim it. "Old man," Dakota said, and the term carried no respect, only contempt, barely disguised as formality. "You pass tests of body, mind, heart, but these tests measure what you do in hours, what choices you make when you know you're being watched, when you know the stakes, when you're trying to prove something. I ask about a lifetime. I ask about years of choices when no one was watching. I ask about what you did before yesterday when there were no tests, no trials, no consequences except the ones you chose to live with." He turned to address Mangus, switching to Apache, and Kaya whispered translation for Ethan's benefit, her voice tight with worry. "He's saying we honor this white man for passing our tests, but do we know his past? Do we know what he did in the 12 years since he came to our land? Maybe he helps one woman one time because we're watching. But maybe he killed many Apache many times before when we weren't watching. Maybe this kindness is the exception and killing is the rule." A murmur ran through the warriors, different from before, carrying uncertainty rather than approval. Doubt creeping back into a situation that had seemed resolved, and Ethan felt his stomach clench with the knowledge that Dakota had found the weak point in the armor, had asked the one question that could unravel everything. Dakota turned back to Ethan, and his eyes were hard as flint, carrying the kind of anger that came from deep wounds, from losses that hadn't healed, from grief that had transformed into rage and stayed there. "Ethan Caldwell, you say you are 40 winters old. You say you came to Arizona Territory in 1880. That is 12 years. 12 years during a time of war between our peoples. 12 years of raids and battles and blood spilled on both sides. 12 years of settlers claiming land that wasn't theirs and Apache trying to take it back or at least make the taking expensive enough to matter." His voice grew louder, more challenging, carrying across the valley so everyone could hear, so there would be no doubt about what was being asked. "Were you part of settler militia? Did you fight against my people? Did you kill Apache warriors who were defending their land, their families, their right to exist in the places where their ancestors had lived for 300 years before white men arrived and decided everything was theirs for the taking?" He paused, letting the questions hang in the air like smoke, like accusations that demanded response, and then delivered the conclusion that made the stakes clear. "Because if you did, then all these pretty words about kindness and change mean nothing. You are our enemy, and we honor you with the blood of our brothers still fresh on your hands, still wet despite the years that have passed, still crying out for justice that we're about to give them by celebrating the man who killed them." Ethan could have lied. There was no way to verify his past, no records that would prove or disprove what he claimed, no witnesses who could contradict whatever story he chose to tell. It would be easy, so easy to simply deny it, to claim he'd never fought, never killed, never been part of the violence that had defined relations between settlers and Apache for decades. But he'd built his defense in the third trial on honesty, on admitting uncertainty and complexity, on choosing truth, even when truth was dangerous, and to lie now would destroy everything he'd earned, would prove that his words about change were hollow, would demonstrate that he was exactly the kind of man who said whatever served his interests, regardless of what was true. So Ethan met Dakota's eyes and chose the truth, knowing it might kill him, knowing it would certainly hurt him, knowing there was no other choice that wouldn't make him hate himself more than he already did. "Yes, I fought against Apache." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of reaction spreading through the assembled warriors. Some hissed in anger. Others gripped their weapons, tighter hands moving to knives and tomahawks, preparing for violence that suddenly seemed inevitable. The fragile peace that had existed moments ago shattered like glass, like something beautiful broken beyond repair. Ethan forced himself to continue to give the full truth rather than the partial truth, to own what he'd done rather than minimize it, because half-truths were just lies wearing disguises. Not as militia. I never joined any official group, but as a homesteader defending what I thought was my land. In 1881, there was a raid on my neighbor's farm, the Williams family. Apache warriors came and took horses and supplies. Williams fought back. People died on both sides. The community was terrified, thought more raids would come, thought we'd all be killed if we didn't do something. He could see Dakota's face splitting into a triumphant smile, see the young warrior recognizing that his gamble had paid off, that he'd been right to question, right to push right, to demand the truth beneath the surface. So 20 of us formed a group to track the raiders. I was the best tracker among the settlers. I'd hunted my whole life back in Tennessee, knew how to read sign, how to follow trails, how to find people who didn't want to be found. I led them to an Apache camp hidden in the mountains. The details felt like confession, like stripping himself naked before judgment, like offering up every part of himself to be weighed and found wanting. There was a fight, brief, brutal, the kind where everything happens too fast to think, where instinct takes over and you do what you've trained to do without considering whether it's right or wrong or something in between. 3 Apache warriors died. I shot one of them for certain, maybe wounded another. It happened so fast I'm not sure. But at least one death is on my hands, at least one man stopped breathing because I pulled a trigger. Dakota's voice rang out in triumph. You hear, he admits it. He killed our brothers, and now we honor him, now we call him proven. This is betrayal of our dead. This is spitting on the graves of warriors who died defending what was theirs. This is choosing the enemy over our own people. Other voices joined in, angry and getting angrier, the careful structure of the ceremony collapsing into something that felt like mob violence waiting to happen. And Ethan understood that he was about to die not in trial, but in vengeance, which was perhaps what he'd deserved all along. But Dakota wasn't finished. He drew his knife, a wicked blade of Spanish steel that gleamed in the afternoon light, and held it high so everyone could see. I challenge this honor, I demand combat trial, him against me, knives only. If he has a true heart like you claim, let him prove it with blood. If I win, he dies as he deserves, as our brothers deserved, as justice demands. If he wins, then maybe he has earned the right to live among us, to be called proven, to be honored, instead of killed. Mangus looked torn, caught between the ceremony he'd just completed and this new challenge he couldn't easily refuse without appearing weak, without suggesting that Dakota's question wasn't legitimate, without creating division among his own people. The chief's eyes moved from Dakota to Ethan and back again, calculating, judging, trying to find the path that preserved unity while honoring tradition. Finally, he looked at Ethan and spoke, and Kaya's translation was almost unnecessary because the meaning was clear in Mangus's expression, in his tone, in the way he held himself. My father asks if you accept this challenge. Ethan was exhausted, pushed beyond the limits of what his 40-year-old body could endure. 6 hours tied to a post had left him dehydrated and weak. His wrists were cut and bandaged. His legs trembled with fatigue. His mind was foggy with the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving what should have killed him. Dakota was 30 years younger, fresh-skilled with a blade, in ways that came from constant practice, from a culture that valued combat prowess, from a life spent preparing for exactly this kind of fight. This wasn't a fair contest. This was an execution with extra steps, a formality that would end with Ethan's blood soaking into the dirt while Dakota stood over him victorious. But accepting was the only option that offered any possibility of survival, and refusing would mean immediate death at the hands of 400 warriors who would see refusal as cowardice, as proof that his words about courage and change were empty lies. I accept. Kaya stepped forward, her composure finally breaking completely, her voice rising with desperation that couldn't be contained anymore. No, this isn't fair. He's exhausted. He's already proven himself. This is murder disguised as honor. But Ethan held up a hand to stop her, and his voice was gentle despite the circumstances, understanding, despite the danger, accepting, despite the unfairness. Fair. I helped kill his people, Kaya. I led settlers to an Apache camp and participated in violence that left 3 men dead. This is fair. This is more than fair. This is justice asking for what it's owed. He looked at Dakota, meeting those angry eyes with something that might have been respect, might have been understanding, might have been the recognition that they were both shaped by losses neither of them had chosen, but both of them had to carry. But before we fight, I want to tell a story about why I was there that day, what happened, what it made me become, what I've lived with ever since. He paused, making sure Dakota was listening, making sure everyone was listening. If after hearing it you still want my blood, we fight, and may the better man win. Dakota sneered, his contempt obvious. Old man's trick, stalling for time, hoping words will save you when only blood can settle this debt. No trick, just truth, all of it. The parts that damn me as much as the parts that explain me. The parts that make me guilty and the parts that make me human. You deserve to know who you're killing and why deserve to understand the full weight of what happened rather than just the surface of it. Mangus considered this, his weathered face showing the calculation of someone who understood that truth sometimes mattered more than timing, that understanding the full context could change how justice was administered, and finally he nodded. Speak. We will listen. Then there will be combat if Dakota still demands it. But let the full truth be known before blood is spilled, so that when we tell the story of this day, we can say we knew what we were doing and why. Ethan sat down in the dirt, too tired to stand for this, too exhausted to maintain the pretense of strength he no longer possessed, and the warriors formed a tighter circle around him, creating an amphitheater of judgment where his words would be weighed against his deeds and found either sufficient or wanting. Kaya sat beside him close enough that their shoulders almost touched, a gesture of support she probably shouldn't have made, but did anyway, refusing to abandon him, even when abandoning might have been the smarter choice, the safer choice, the choice that protected her from being associated with whatever came next. 1880. I came to Arizona Territory with my wife Catherine. We were poor, desperate for a new start. Tennessee was destroyed by the war, our farm burned, our future erased by forces we couldn't control. The Homestead Act promised free land if you could improve it, make it productive, 160 acres if you could survive 5 years. It sounded like salvation to people who had nothing left to lose. He looked around at the faces watching him, some hostile, some curious, all waiting to hear what justification he could offer for being part of the machinery that had destroyed their way of life. We didn't know this land was already claimed. Or maybe we didn't want to know. Maybe we told ourselves that empty desert meant unclaimed desert, that absence of white settlers meant absence of ownership, that if we couldn't see villages and farms, then the land must be free for taking. We saw what we wanted to see and ignored what we should have acknowledged. That Apache had lived here for 300 years, that this was your home long before it was ours. That the government's permission to settle didn't actually make the land ours, just made our theft legal under laws you never agreed to follow. The honesty seemed to surprise some of the warriors, seemed to shift something in how they were listening, from looking for lies to trying to understand truth. The first 2 years were peaceful. We built our cabin, dug a well-planted crops, corn, beans, squash, the trinity that keeps people alive when nothing else will. Catherine got pregnant in 1882. We were happy, hopeful. We thought we'd found our place in the world, thought we could build a future here, thought that maybe the violence we'd heard about wouldn't touch us because we weren't hurting anyone, weren't taking anything that someone else needed, weren't participating in the worst of what settlers did. His voice grew rougher, the memories cutting like broken glass. Then came the raid. Summer of 1881. The Williams family, our neighbors 5 miles east. Apache warriors came for horses and supplies. He paused, making sure they heard what came next, making sure they understood he recognized the context. The Apache had been pushed onto reservations, hunting grounds taken, food sources destroyed. You were raiding because you were starving, because the government that promised to feed you if you stayed on reservations was failing to keep that promise, was letting you die slowly rather than letting you live freely. He saw some heads nod, saw recognition that he understood more than the simple narrative of savages attacking innocent settlers. We didn't think about that then. We didn't ask why Apache would risk death to steal horses. We just thought you were attacking us, threatening us, proving that we couldn't be safe until you were completely controlled or completely destroyed. Williams fought back. 2 Apache warriors died in that fight. 1 settler was wounded. The whole community panicked, thought more raids would come, thought we'd all be killed if we didn't respond with overwhelming force. Ethan's throat was dry, and he paused to wet his lips, wishing for water he knew wouldn't come until this was finished. So 20 of us formed a group to track the raiders. I was the best tracker among the settlers. I'd hunted my whole life back in Tennessee. I knew how to read sign, how to follow trails that most men couldn't see, how to find what others missed. And I used that skill to lead them to your camp, to lead them to violence, to lead them to killing. The words felt like confession, like showing wounds he'd kept hidden, like admitting sins he'd tried to pretend didn't count because everyone else was doing the same thing. The fight that followed was chaos. You were ready for us. Had scouts who'd seen us coming, who'd warned the camp, who'd prepared defenses we hadn't expected. It wasn't a massacre. It was a battle. 3 Apache died. 1 settler named Thomas Mitchell took a bullet to the chest and bled out before we could get him home. 3 more settlers were injured badly enough they never fully recovered, carried scars and pain for the rest of their lives. He met Dakota's eyes directly, refusing to look away, refusing to minimize what came next. I saw their faces afterward, the Apache we'd killed. One of them was young, maybe 17, just a boy trying to feed his family, trying to do what he'd been taught was right and honorable and necessary. And I realized, standing there looking at his face, that he'd been defending his home the same way I thought I was defending mine. The only difference was whose home the government decided mattered, whose claim to the land was recognized under laws written by people who'd never set foot in this desert and didn't care who died as long as expansion continued. The admission hung in the air like smoke, like evidence of crimes that couldn't be undone, like truth that couldn't be unsaid once spoken. After that, I couldn't do it anymore. I told the other settlers I was done, that I wouldn't track for them again, wouldn't participate in the cycle of violence that fed itself on blood and grief and the pretense that we were the victims when we were the invaders. They called me a coward. Maybe I was. Maybe I just couldn't live with what I'd seen, what I'd done, what I'd become in the name of protecting what was never really mine to protect. He took a breath, feeling the weight of what came next, the personal loss that had shaped everything after. Then in 1883 my wife died in childbirth, 18 hours of labor. Complications we couldn't fix, no doctor within 40 miles, no help that could save her or the baby. She died, and the baby died with her. And I was left alone with blood on my hands and nothing in my heart but ash and regret, and the awareness that I'd participated in creating death while being unable to prevent it when it came for the people I loved. His voice dropped lower, more intimate, sharing pain that he rarely let anyone see. I've lived alone ever since. 9 years of isolation. 9 years of thinking it was penance, thinking that if I stayed away from people, I couldn't hurt anyone else, couldn't participate in more violence, couldn't add to the weight I was already carrying. But isolation isn't penance. It's just cowardice dressed up as mourning, hiding disguised as honor, running away, given a noble name to make it feel less shameful. He looked at Dakota again, at the young warrior whose anger had driven this confrontation, whose loss had created the need for justice, whose pain deserved acknowledgement, even if Ethan's death wouldn't heal it. So yes, I killed your people. I helped kill them anyway, participated in violence that left at least 1 man dead and maybe more. And if you want blood for blood, I understand. Maybe I deserve it. Maybe this is how the universe balances accounts, how justice gets served when the law won't do it, how the dead get honored by those who loved them. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. And then Dakota spoke, and his voice was different somehow, less triumphant, more thoughtful, carrying questions rather than accusations. "What month was this raid?" The question seemed strange, too specific, and Ethan felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. He couldn't name. 1881, July, middle of July. Why? What was the settler's name who died? Ethan's mouth went dry, and he knew somehow that this answer mattered in ways he couldn't predict, that the specifics he'd thought were just details were actually keys to understanding he'd been missing. "Thomas Mitchell. Why are you asking?" Dakota's face twisted with emotion, anger and grief and something more complicated, something that looked like recognition mixed with horror. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of revelation, of connections being made, of understanding, arriving like lightning. "Because I was in that fight. I was 17 winters old. It was my first real battle, my chance to prove myself as a warrior, to show I was worthy of being called a man among my people." The words hit Ethan like physical blows, like punches to the gut, and he felt the air leave his lungs as understanding crashed over him like a wave. Dakota's voice cracked slightly as he continued, as he shared truth that explained everything that made the hatred personal in ways that transcended general grievance. "The young Apache you saw dead, the one you thought was 17, the one whose face you remember, the one who made you realize he was defending his home just like you thought you were defending yours." Dakota paused, and tears ran down his face, now cutting tracks through war paint, making him look younger than 28. Making him look like the boy he'd been when this started. "That was my cousin, Neshoba. He hunts. He was teaching me to track, to hunt, to survive in the new world we were being forced into. He was my teacher, my brother in everything but blood, my friend who believed I could become something worthy." The silence that fell over the arena was absolute, so complete that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing through his ears, could hear the sound of the world holding its breath while two men faced the full weight of what connected them. "I found his body after the fight, held him while he grew cold. I was covered in his blood, wearing it like second skin, and I swore I would kill every white man I met." Dakota looked at Ethan with eyes that held a lifetime of pain, and his voice was barely above a whisper, now thick with emotion that years hadn't diminished. "I should kill you now. Every part of me wants to. Every memory of Neshoba, every moment of grief, every time I've thought about what he could have become if he'd lived, all of it demands your blood, demands justice, demands that I honor him by making you pay for what you took." He shook his head slowly, and something in his expression shifted, softened, became less certain. "But I listened to your story, and I hear something I didn't expect. I hear guilt. I hear regret. I hear a man who carries the same weight I carry, who lost family, like I lost family, who lives with ghosts. Like I live with ghosts, who wakes up thinking about the dead and goes to sleep wondering if anything matters when the people who mattered most are gone." Dakota's hand moved to his knife, and Ethan thought this was it, thought the revelation would lead to violence, thought that understanding wouldn't prevent death, only explain it. But instead of drawing the blade, Dakota sheathed it, the gesture sudden and final, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that sounded almost like peace, or at least the beginning of it. "You didn't kill for pleasure. You didn't hunt us for sport. You killed because you were afraid, because you thought you were defending your home, because you'd been taught that we were savages who needed to be controlled or destroyed, because the government and the churches and the newspapers all told you that we weren't really people, weren't really human, weren't really deserving of the same mercy you'd extend to white families in the same situation." He paused, and what came next felt like the most important thing anyone had said all day. "I killed settlers that day, too. Shot Thomas Mitchell in the chest. Watched him fall. Watched him die. Did that make me evil? Did that make you evil? Or were we both just men trying to protect what we loved, both shaped by forces bigger than ourselves, both caught in a conflict neither of us started, but both of us had to participate in, because the alternative was letting our families die?" Dakota turned to address all the assembled warriors, his voice rising to carry across the valley to make sure everyone heard what he was about to say. "This man carries guilt in his eyes. I see it. It's the same guilt I carry when I think about Thomas Mitchell, when I remember his face, when I wonder if his wife cried the way I cried, if his children grew up angry, like I grew up angry, if his death left holes in other people's lives the way Neshoba's death left holes in mine." He gestured to Ethan with something that might have been respect, might have been understanding, might have been the recognition that they were more alike than different, despite everything that separated them. He lost his family. We lost our families. He lives alone and haunted. Many of us live the same way. Killing him won't bring back Neshoba, won't bring back anyone. It will just add more death to a pile already too high, already heavy enough to crush us under its weight if we let it already demanding more than we should be willing to pay. Dakota extended his hand to Ethan, not in the white man's way of shaking, but palm to palm the warrior's grip of equals, the gesture that acknowledged shared humanity despite all the differences that should have made that acknowledgement impossible. "I don't forgive you. Maybe I never will. Maybe I'll carry the anger for the rest of my life, wake up some mornings and wish I'd killed you when I had the chance, wonder if mercy makes me weak or wise. But I don't kill you either because you are a reflection of me. We both killed. We both lost. We both carry scars that will never fully heal. And killing you won't make my scars hurt less. It will just prove I learned nothing from all this pain, that I'm still the angry 17-year-old boy holding his cousin's body and swearing revenge instead of the man I could become if I chose differently." Ethan took the offered hand, feeling the strength in Dakota's grip, feeling the trembling that suggested how much this cost him, how hard it was to choose mercy, when revenge felt so much more satisfying, how difficult it was to break cycles that had been repeating for generations. "Thank you." The words were inadequate, insufficient to express what Ethan felt, but they were all he had, all that fit in the moment, all that could bridge the distance between gratitude and understanding. On the New Mexico porch in 1920, Wyatt was crying openly now, the tears falling without shame, without embarrassment, without the self-consciousness that usually made boys his age hide emotion as weakness. "He forgave you even though you killed his cousin." Ethan shook his head gently, correcting without criticizing. "Not forgave, understood. There's a difference, boy. Forgiveness wipes the slate clean, pretends the harm never happened, asks people to forget pain that can't be forgotten. Understanding accepts that the slate will always have marks on it, that the harm can't be erased, but chooses peace anyway, chooses to stop letting the past dictate the future, chooses to break the cycle even when breaking it feels like betraying the dead." He let that settle before continuing, knowing this was important, knowing Wyatt needed to hear this in ways that went beyond the story. "Dakota could have killed me, would have been justified by any standard his people recognized. But he chose something harder than vengeance. He chose to stop the cycle of violence, to refuse to let Neshoba's death create another death, to honor his cousin's memory by becoming better rather than by making me worse." Wyatt's hand moved to his bruised cheek, the gesture unconscious, and Ethan saw understanding blooming in his grandson's eyes. "Is that what I should do with the boys at school? Understand them instead of hating them. Understand that they're scared. Yes. People hurt others when they're afraid of what's different, when your difference reminds them they're ordinary, when seeing someone who belongs to two worlds makes them feel small because they only belong to one. Understanding doesn't make what they did right, doesn't excuse the bruise on your face, doesn't mean you have to be friends with people who hurt you. But it means you don't have to carry their fear as your shame, don't have to let their hate become your hate, don't have to perpetuate the cycle by becoming what they accuse you of being." Wyatt nodded slowly, and something in his posture changed, became less defeated, more determined. "Did you stay with them, Grandpa? After everything? After Dakota chose not to kill you?" Ethan smiled, the expression carrying warmth and sadness in equal measure. "That's where the story gets interesting, boy. because choosing to stay with people who'd tested you and found you worthy turned out to be easier than figuring out how to actually live among them, how to bridge the gap between acceptance and belonging, how to become something neither fully white nor fully Apache, but useful to both. The feast that followed the proving was unlike anything Ethan had experienced. They rode back to his cabin as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that made the whole world look like it was on fire. And the 400 warriors who'd come to judge him made camp around his small adobe home, transforming the space from isolation to community in the span of an hour. Women arrived from a different direction, having ridden a separate path with supplies and cooking equipment. Their presence suggesting that this outcome had been planned for, or at least prepared for that success, had been considered possible even if failure seemed more likely. Food was shared communally, passed around the fire in careful order that spoke of hierarchy and respect woven together. Elders first, then proven warriors, then younger men, and everyone ate exactly their share, no more and no less, taking what they needed, but leaving enough for others, practicing in the small moments the same principles they'd tested him on. Coffee from Ethan's supply became a rare luxury, and young warriors crowded around to learn how he made it over an open fire, their questions carrying genuine curiosity rather than mockery, their attention suggesting he'd moved from outsider to someone whose knowledge might be worth acquiring. Chaitin, the old warrior who'd chanted during the first trial, came and sat beside Ethan as the evening deepened into night, his weathered face showing 67 years of survival that should have been impossible. "You did well, white man." His English was broken, but understandable, shaped by years of trading and negotiating and learning enemy languages, because survival sometimes depended on communication. "I am 67 winters, was proven at 23. You are 40 proven today. Different paths, same destination." He shared his own story, then speaking in a mixture of English and Apache that Kaya translated when necessary, telling of being captured by Mexican soldiers at 19, of escaping and being tested when he returned to prove he hadn't betrayed the tribe, of passing trials that were different in their specifics but identical in their purpose. "We are brothers in survival now. The stones on your wrist mark you as someone who endured what should have broken him and came through whole enough to continue. That is worth respecting regardless of what skin you wear or what language you speak or where your ancestors came from." Dakota approached later, still radiating tension, but no longer hostile, his presence suggesting he was working through something complicated, something that didn't have easy answers or simple resolutions. "I don't like you, old man." The words were blunt, honest, carrying no pretense of false friendship. "But I respect you. You didn't beg for your life when you could have. You didn't lie about what you did when lying might have saved you. You faced truth even when truth could kill you. That is warrior behavior, and I honor it even if I can't like the man who displays it." He struggled with something internal, his face showing the effort of saying what came next. "I'm sorry about your wife, about your loss, about the child who never lived. Loss is loss regardless of whose family it touches, and I know what it feels like to bury people who should have lived longer, who deserved better than what the world gave them." "I'm sorry about your cousin," Ethan replied quietly. "About Neshoba. About the future he never got to have, the man he never got to become, the life that was stolen from him by violence that should never have happened. Sorry doesn't bring them back." Dakota's voice was flat, stating fact rather than making accusation. "No. But maybe acknowledging the loss helps carry it. Maybe knowing that someone else recognizes what was taken makes the weight feel less crushing. Maybe that's all we can offer the dead, the promise to remember them and to try to be better than we were when they died." Dakota nodded slowly, and something in his eyes suggested Ethan had passed another test smaller than the ones in the valley, but no less important, the test of treating grief with respect rather than trying to fix it with platitudes. But it was Kaya who brought Ethan the portion of the meal that carried the most significance, who approached with something wrapped in corn husks and offered it with a formality that suggested ceremony rather than simple hospitality. "Roasted rabbit heart. In our culture, the heart is given to the honored guest. It means you have earned our heart's trust, that we see you as worthy of our most vulnerable selves, that we acknowledge you as someone who could hurt us but choose instead to protect." She hesitated, then added something that seemed more personal than cultural, seemed to come from Kaya rather than from tradition. "You gave me back my mother's knife. The only piece of her I have left in this world, the only thing I can touch, that she touched, that her hands shaped, that her love created. I give you this symbolic heart in return. We are connected now whether we choose it or not, whether we wanted this or not, whether it makes sense or not. The threads that bind us were woven in tests and truth, and those are the strongest threads there are." Ethan took the offering with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that this was more than food, more than gesture, more than symbol. This was a promise of protection, of belonging, of being seen in a way he hadn't been seen since Catherine died, of mattering to people who had no reason to make him matter, except that he'd proven himself worthy of the effort. As the night deepened and most of the warriors drifted toward sleep, Mangus gestured for Ethan to walk with him away from the fire, away from listening ears, away from the collective, into a space where private conversations could happen. Kaya followed to translate her presence, serving as bridge between two men who spoke different languages, but were beginning to understand each other in ways that transcended words. The chief's proposal was straightforward, delivered without preamble, without softening, without pretense that this was anything other than a transaction where both parties had needs that might be met through cooperation. "Stay for 3 moons. Learn from us. Teach us. Help negotiate with the Indian agent when the time comes. Be an advisor, a bridge person who understands both worlds and can translate not just language, but intention, not just words, but meaning. After 3 moons. If it doesn't work, leave with no shame, no judgment, no consequences, except knowing you tried. But if it does work, consider staying longer. Consider becoming something neither fully white nor fully Apache, but something new, that this changing world needs something that might help both our peoples survive what's coming." Mangus's reasoning was pragmatic, shaped by the awareness that the world was changing in ways that couldn't be stopped, only navigated. "I am old. Maybe 5 winters left. I feel death approaching the way you feel a storm building before the first drops fall. I need someone who understands both sides of the conflict that is destroying my people, who can speak to the agents and soldiers and settlers in ways they'll listen to, who can help my people understand the new realities without losing touch with who we are and where we come from." His voice carried genuine need rather than manipulation, showed vulnerability rather than weakness. "You understand loss. You understand survival at terrible cost. You understand what it means to carry guilt and try to become better despite it, to wake up hating who you were while trying to be someone different, to live with the weight of what can't be changed while working to change what can be. Those are valuable understandings, rare enough that I can't afford to waste them, important enough that I'm willing to take a risk on a white man if it means preserving even a piece of what we are for the generations that come after." The brutal honesty that came next showed respect through directness, showed he thought Ethan was strong enough to hear truth without needing it softened. "The American government will force all Apache onto reservations soon, 3 years, maybe less. We will lose this war. We are already losing it, have been losing it since the first white men arrived with their guns and their diseases and their absolute certainty that God wanted them to have everything we had. But I want to lose with dignity, want to preserve what can be preserved, want to give my grandchildren some thread of connection to who we were, even if they have to live in a world we don't recognize." He paused, then delivered the conclusion that made the stakes clear. "You can help with that, or you can return to your cabin and die alone in 20 years wondering if your life meant anything, wondering if you made any difference, wondering if the pain you survived taught you anything worth knowing. The choice is yours, but make it knowing what you're choosing between." It was the most brutally honest assessment anyone had ever given Ethan, and he respected Mangus for not softening it, for not pretending the choice was between good and better rather than between different kinds of hard. "Let me sleep on it. I'll give you an answer in the morning." Mangus nodded acceptance. "Good. Think carefully. This is not a small decision. This is choosing what kind of man you want to be for whatever time you have left, choosing whether the proving matters only in the valley or whether it changes how you live every day after. Ethan spent that night by the dying fire after everyone else had found their sleeping places, his mind churning with possibilities and fears, with arguments for and against, with the awareness that whatever he decided would shape the rest of his life in ways he couldn't fully predict. The arguments against staying were numerous and compelling. He was 40 years old, too old to learn a new language fluently, too set in his patterns to truly adapt to a radically different culture. He'd killed Apache warriors and would always be an outsider, would always carry the mark of that violence, regardless of how much he tried to atone. White society would call him a traitor. An Indian lover would shun him as someone who'd betrayed his own kind. Apache society would never fully trust him, would always see him as the white man, no matter what he did or how long he stayed. But the arguments for staying were simpler and somehow more powerful. What did he have if he returned to his solitary life? Nothing. 12 years of isolation hadn't made him happy, hadn't healed the wound of Catherine's death, hadn't given his life meaning or purpose or anything except the slow erosion of hope. Today, standing in that sacred valley passing those trials, he'd felt more alive than he had since 1883. These people had tested him, truly tested him, and found him worthy. They'd seen him at his worst and his best and decided he was worth something. That acknowledgement, that recognition, that acceptance meant more than all the years of isolation had ever offered. Kaya needed an ally in her struggle to prove herself capable of leadership in a culture that preferred its women silent and decorative. Mangus needed a bridge to navigate the impossible situation of trying to preserve culture while accepting defeat. Even Dakota had found a way to honor his cousin's memory by choosing connection over vengeance. Ethan imagined Catherine sitting beside him the way she used to on Tennessee nights before the war came and destroyed everything, and he asked the empty air what she would want him to do. Her voice came from memory, patient and wise, carrying the warmth that had first made him love her. "I'd want you to live, Ethan. Not just exist, not just survive, but actually live. Connect with people. Matter to someone. Be part of something larger than your own grief. I died trying to bring life into the world. Don't dishonor that by spending the rest of yours hiding from it." By the time the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, Ethan had made his decision. He stood stretched, muscles that ached from yesterday's ordeal, and walked to where Mangus was already awake, sitting cross-legged and watching the dawn with the patience of someone who'd seen thousands of sunrises and knew each one was precious. Ethan didn't need words. He simply knelt and held out his wrist, the one bearing the 3 stones, in a gesture of commitment that transcended language. Mangus looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and decisive, the movement that sealed agreements and bound futures. Good. It was one of the few English words Mangus knew, and he used it with satisfaction. "We begin today." But as Ethan stood and turned to face this new chapter of his life, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A rider in the distance coming fast, and even from half a mile away, the blue uniform was unmistakable. United States Cavalry. And trouble, as always, seemed to find Ethan, even when he chose peace. Lieutenant Hayes from Fort Apache saw 420 Apache warriors surrounding a white man's cabin and assumed hostage situation. Assumed he needed to rescue a fellow American from savages. Assumed violence was the answer before he'd even asked the question. Ethan had to stand between the cavalry and the Apache, literally placing his body in the space where bullets would fly if this went wrong, and convince Hayes that these people were here peacefully, that they were leaving in the morning, that no one needed to die today, if everyone could just take a breath and step back. Hayes didn't want to listen. Young officer fresh from West Point, all full of certainty about who was right and who was wrong, convinced that Indians were problems to be solved rather than people to be understood. But Ethan talked fast and talked well, promising to escort the Apache back toward the reservation, personally promising to take responsibility if anything went wrong, promising to report to Fort Apache within 24 hours to explain everything in detail. Hayes agreed reluctantly, recognizing that starting a battle he couldn't win wasn't actually the heroic move it felt like, and rode off to watch from a distance while Ethan exhaled breath he hadn't known he was holding. That night, sitting by the fire with Mangus and Kaya and the others, Ethan realized something profound. This was what his life would be now if he stayed. Standing between two sides that wanted to kill each other, trying to find the narrow space where peace could exist, using his body as bridge when words failed, risking death from both sides in the hope that understanding was possible even when it seemed impossible. It was terrifying. It was exhausting. It was exactly what he needed. The first 3 months were brutal in ways that had nothing to do with physical hardship and everything to do with learning how to exist in a culture so different from his own that sometimes it felt like he'd landed on a different planet rather than just joined a different community. Apache language was nothing like English, all clicks and flowing sounds that his tongue couldn't seem to wrap around, no matter how many times Kaya patiently corrected him. Words he thought he'd learned turned out to mean completely different things depending on context or tone or the hand gestures that accompanied them. Customs were complex rules about who could speak to whom, when silence was required, how to show respect without words, how to navigate social hierarchies that had no written codes, but everyone seemed to understand instinctively, except him. He made mistakes constantly, embarrassed himself. Daily, felt like a child learning to walk while everyone around him ran with grace and ease. But the older people were patient, especially the elders like Chaitin, who seemed to take pleasure in teaching, who treated his ignorance as opportunity rather than burden. Chaitin taught him tracking techniques that went far beyond anything Ethan had learned in Tennessee, showed him how to read the desert, like a book where every disturbed stone and bent blade of grass told stories, how to find water where none seemed to exist, how to navigate by stars and wind and the shape of distant mountains. Kaya taught him language every evening by the fire, sitting for hours, pointing to objects and speaking their names, correcting his pronunciation with laughter that was kind rather than mocking. Teaching him not just words, but the culture embedded in how those words were used. Sometimes Mangus would join them, and through their broken conversations, Ethan began to understand the chief's mind, his fears for his people, his determination to preserve what could be preserved, even as everything else was stripped away. 3 months became 6, then a year, and Ethan found himself splitting time between his cabin and the Apache camp, living in both worlds, belonging fully to neither, becoming something in between that had no name but served a purpose. White settlers in Wilcox started treating him differently, calling him Indian lover and Apache sympathizer, refusing to do business or turning their backs when he approached. Henry Thompson, who ran the general store, would sell him flour, but only after spitting in the dirt. First, a small gesture of contempt that spoke volumes about how he was seen. Ethan lost most of his old neighbors, people he'd defended alongside back in '81, people who'd fought beside him and now wouldn't speak to him because he'd chosen wrong. In their eyes had betrayed his race by choosing understanding over hatred. But he'd found something more valuable than their approval. He'd found purpose. He'd found people who'd tested him and found him worthy, and that mattered more than whether settlers he barely liked were willing to sell him supplies without making their disgust obvious. In 1895, the government order came. All Apache must report to reservations immediately. No more free-ranging, no more traditional life, no more pretending that treaties meant anything or that promises would be kept or that their way of life could continue. Mangus gathered his people, and Ethan stood beside him when he made the decision to comply, when he chose survival over pride, when he accepted defeat because fighting would mean dying, and dying wouldn't save anyone. It broke something in Mangus, that surrender. He was 66 years old, and the weight of surrender aged him beyond his years, and Ethan watched him age a decade in a single day, watched the weight of loss settle on him like physical burden, watched him transform from leader to broken old man, mourning everything he couldn't save. They walked onto the reservation together, 420 people giving up everything they'd known, everything their ancestors had known for 300 years, to live in wooden houses on land that couldn't support them, eating food the government provided when it remembered to provide it, slowly dying of despair when the diseases didn't kill them fast enough. Mangus lasted one more year. Died in his sleep in 1895, his heart simply giving up, unable to carry the weight of all he'd lost, and Ethan was there at his burial, allowed to participate in the ceremony because Mangus had requested it before he died, had said that Ethan had earned the right to mourn with family. Kaya took over much of the leadership after her father's death, though she could never be chief, formally could never hold the title that only men were allowed to claim. But people listened to her, respected her judgment, followed her guidance because she'd been proven right about Ethan, about trusting an outsider, about the value of bridges in a world that wanted only walls. She married in 1896, not for alliance, but for love, choosing a man who valued her mind as much as her beauty, and Ethan was honored to attend the wedding to see her find happiness, even in the midst of loss. She had 3 beautiful children, and Ethan watched them grow, taught them to read and write English, while their mother taught them Apache traditions, trying to give them tools for both worlds they'd have to navigate. 1897 brought Hannah into Ethan's life, and with her came the possibility of futures he'd thought were closed forever. She was Kaya's cousin, 28 years old, visiting from a different band that had been moved to the same reservation, never married, despite being beautiful and sharp-tongued, and carrying intelligence that made men nervous. Ethan first saw her when he was trying to help some children with arithmetic, getting frustrated because the language barrier was making simple math impossible to explain, because numbers apparently didn't translate as cleanly as he'd assumed. Hannah walked over, took the stick he'd been using to draw numbers in the dirt, and explained the concept in Apache, so clearly the children understood immediately, their faces lighting up with comprehension he'd been unable to create. Then she turned to him and said in perfect English, her accent carrying the precision of someone who'd learned the language through study rather than immersion. "You're Ethan Caldwell, the white man who is proven. My cousin speaks highly of you, though I can't imagine why. You're too old, too serious, and you don't smile nearly enough." Ethan stood there with his mouth open, unable to think of a single thing to say, unable to process that this beautiful, confident woman had just insulted him in 3 different ways and somehow made it sound like an invitation. Hannah laughed, the sound bright and unself-conscious, and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving him standing in the dust, wondering what had just happened. It took him 6 months to work up the courage to court her properly, following both Apache and white customs, because he wanted to do this right, wanted to show respect for both cultures, wanted to prove he was serious. He brought gifts to her family, horses and blankets and food, demonstrating he could provide. He asked permission from the elders, showing he understood protocol. He tried to impress Hannah directly with wildflowers. She laughed at because she could pick her own with poetry. She critiqued because his pronunciation was terrible, with dinners he cooked that she taught him to improve. She tested him in ways that went beyond the proving, asking if he could weave baskets, if he could speak Apache without sounding like a dying cow, if he could make her laugh, and somehow, miraculously, he passed enough of her tests that she agreed to consider his proposal. "Why do you want to marry me, Ethan?" She asked it directly, refusing to accept easy answers. "Because I'm beautiful, because I'm smart, because you're lonely. Because when I'm with you, I remember how to be alive," he answered honestly. "Because you see me not as white man or outsider or project to be managed, but just as Ethan. And that's enough for you. That simple acknowledgement of my humanity, of my worth beyond what I can do or provide or prove, that's the most precious thing anyone's offered me since Catherine died." Hannah was silent for a long time, studying him with those dark eyes that seemed to see through pretense to truth beneath. And then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. "That is a good answer. You may ask me properly now." They married in spring of 1898, a ceremony that blended both traditions, Apache blessing and Christian prayer woven together, Kaya standing up for both of them because she'd brought them together even if she hadn't known she was doing it. Their son was born in December of that same year, and when Ethan held him for the first time, feeling the weight of new life in his arms, seeing eyes that held both his features and Hannah's, he wept for Catherine and Daniel and all the futures that had been lost while being grateful for this future that had somehow impossibly arrived. 20 years they had together. 20 years of happiness built on the foundation of loss of love that knew how fragile it was and chose to exist anyway, of mornings waking up beside someone who made life feel worth living and nights falling asleep knowing tomorrow would bring more of the same. Hannah died in 1918, the influenza epidemic that swept through the reservation like wildfire, killing the young and old and strong and weak without discrimination, taking 50 people in 3 months and leaving holes in families that would never fill. She was 50 when she died, and they'd had 2 decades together, and Ethan mourned her with everything he had while being grateful for what they'd shared, knowing that some people never got even 1 day of what they'd had for 20 years. Kaya died that same year, within months of Hannah, both women taken by the same epidemic, both losses that felt like the world ending. After they were gone, after the 2 women who'd anchored him to the reservation were dead, Ethan found himself adrift in ways he hadn't expected, surrounded by people who knew him but didn't remember why he mattered, young people who saw only an old white man with stories about the past rather than someone who'd helped shape their present. His son was grown, had married, wanted to make his own way without his father hovering, and Ethan understood that impulse, recognized the need to define yourself rather than be defined by your parents. In 1919, Ethan left the reservation and moved to New Mexico, buying land. Legally, no homesteading, no claiming what wasn't his, just a simple purchase from a widow who needed to sell. He built a small house, lived a quiet life, saw his son and grandson twice a year when they visited, and that was enough. He didn't need to be at the center of things anymore. He'd done his part, built his bridges, left his legacy in people like his son and grandson who carried 2 cultures and saw that as strength rather than confusion. On the New Mexico porch in May of 1920, with the afternoon sun beginning its descent toward evening, Ethan finished his story and looked at his grandson with eyes that had seen too much loss and just enough love to make the loss bearable. "So that's how I got these stones, Wyatt. That's how I learned that being proven isn't about 1 moment of courage or 1 day of endurance, but about choosing every single day after to be someone worth the trouble people took to test you, to be someone who honors the proving by living like it mattered." Wyatt was crying again, but these were different tears, not shame or fear, but something closer to understanding, to recognition of truth that resonated with his own struggles. "You're proud to be part Apache, aren't you, Grandpa? Even though it made things harder, even though people treated you badly. I'm proud to have known the people I knew, to have learned what I learned, to have loved who I loved." Ethan's voice was gentle, patient, carrying no judgment. "The Apache taught me that strength comes from endurance, that wisdom comes from choosing to give when taking would be easier, that truth matters more than comfort. Your grandmother Hannah taught me that love is possible after loss, that futures can be built even when pasts are destroyed. Your father taught me that bridges between cultures produce children stronger than either culture alone could create." He took Wyatt's hands in his weathered ones, holding them with a gentleness that 68 years of hard living hadn't destroyed. "Those boys at school are afraid of what you represent. Your proof that people can belong to more than one world, can carry more than one identity, can be complex instead of simple. That frightens people who need everything to fit in neat categories, who can't handle ambiguity, who would rather hate than understand. But that's their weakness, not yours. You're a bridge, Wyatt, like I was, like your father is, and bridges connect things that need connecting. The world needs more bridges and fewer walls, more understanding and less fear, more people willing to stand in the space between and say, both sides matter, both perspectives have value, both cultures offer something worth preserving." He touched the 3 stones on his wrist, the gesture automatic after 28 years. When I die, these stones go to you. White for endurance, red for wisdom, black for truth. They're not magic. They won't make you proven. But they'll remind you that being proven is possible, that tests can be passed, that who you are today doesn't have to be who you are tomorrow. That change is real and redemption is possible, and becoming better is something you can choose every single morning when you wake up. Wyatt looked at the stones with something like reverence, with understanding that they represented more than decoration, more than tradition, more than heritage. What test will I face, Grandpa? I don't know, boy, but I know this. When it comes, you'll recognize it. It'll be the moment when the easy choice and the right choice aren't the same thing. When what you want and what you should do pull in opposite directions. When being true to yourself means disappointing people who want you to be someone else. He pulled his grandson close, feeling the boy's tears soaking into his shirt, feeling the weight of responsibility passing from one generation to the next. And when that moment comes, you'll remember this conversation. You'll remember that your grandfather stood in a canyon with 400 warriors ready to kill him and chose truth anyway. You'll remember that Dakota chose understanding over vengeance. You'll remember that bridges are built one choice at a time, one moment of courage, one instance of choosing connection over division. I'm proud to be part Apache, Wyatt said suddenly, the words coming out firm, certain no longer ashamed. I'm proud to be your grandson. I'm proud to be a bridge. Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion, felt tears prick his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them, because tears weren't weakness when they came from joy, from recognition that the proving continued, that the legacy lived on, that the story wasn't over just because he was old and tired and approaching the end of his time. Good boy. Now go eat supper before your mother thinks I've kept you out here too long and decides I'm a bad influence. Wyatt laughed and ran inside, and Ethan was left alone on the porch with his memories and his 3 stones, watching the sun set over the New Mexico desert, knowing that his time was short, but his legacy was secure, knowing that he'd done what Mangus had asked, had preserved something worth preserving, had passed on wisdom worth sharing. 3 months later, in August of 1920, Ethan Caldwell died peacefully in his sleep. Morning sun streaming through the window, the 3 stones still on his wrist where they'd been for 28 years. Wyatt inherited the stones and the trunk and the stories and the responsibility of remembering, of keeping alive the truth that bridges were possible, that understanding could triumph over hate, that change was real and redemption was available to anyone willing to endure the proving. The stones passed to Wyatt. The stories lived on. The bridge endured. And that, in the end, was what it meant to be proven. Not the trials themselves, but what you built with the life those trials gave you. Not the moment of testing, but the decades of choices that followed. Not the honor of being called worthy, but the responsibility of living as if you were. This was Ethan Caldwell's legacy. This was his gift. This was his story, complete at last, told to a grandson who would carry it forward into a future Ethan would never see but had helped create. And in the telling and the passing of 3 small stones from one generation to the next, the proving continued, as it always would, as long as there were people willing to choose the harder path, to speak difficult truths, to build bridges instead of walls. The end was also a beginning, and the stones, worn smooth by time and touch and tears, waited patiently to mark another proving, another test, another life transformed by the choice to be better than yesterday, to endure what seemed unendurable, to stand when every part of you wanted to fall.